Okay, good morning. This must be an interesting session to have so many people rise and shine Sunday morning, 8:30, so we're glad you're here. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Wiseman. I am the director of the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, and we welcome you to this very special symposium we're having this morning on a major project that's underway to gauge perceptions of different religious groups regarding science and, perhaps more interestingly, scientists and scientists' perceptions of them. So we're kind of in the midst of this project, but we wanted to share with you some initial results of our studies. The mission of the AAAS, in a nutshell, is to advance science and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. And our little slogan is advancing science, serving society. I like that slogan. And who is society? Well, society for most of the world, and especially also in this country, involves many religious groups and religious communities. And their perceptions of science often are related to their cultural and religious views as well. So we want to understand that a little bit better as scientists to understand how better to communicate with the broader public regarding science and to understand their interests and concerns. This program was born out of that interest back in the 1990s. The program builds on AAAS's long-standing commitment to relate scientific knowledge and technological development to the purposes and concerns of society at large. So our Dialogue, or DoSER program, facilitates communication between scientific and religious communities. This particular project is called Scientists and Religious Communities Investigating Perceptions to Build Understanding. So this is a quite interesting endeavor. It began a few years back when AAAS's advisory committees, especially for the DoSER program, recommended, amongst other types of things that we pursue, that we look into understanding better and improving the relationship somehow between scientists and the segment of the population that's called evangelical Christians. Now, that term is not well defined. It's not a particular denomination. We'll be discussing some of that through the session today. But depending on how you define it, evangelicals are something like 25%, maybe 30% of the U.S. population, and they often have sort of perceived to have mixed interactions with science, some very strongly positive, some problematic. And so the scientific community would like to understand this better, maybe improve communication, if not agreement on all issues with this part of the population. Well, how do we do that? So, that's kind of a difficult and fuzzy task to undertake. So we began communication with an organization known as the National Association of Evangelicals to ask them if they were interested in pursuing this kind of understanding about perceptions or interaction between evangelicals and science. They said, absolutely, but we don't really know ourselves what evangelicals think about about science to any depth. Where are the concerns? It's not necessarily the particular issues that make the headlines. It may be deeper worldview issues, deeper concerns. So they recommended, and we agreed, that maybe the first step before we start having meetings and dialogues and so forth is that we do a really in-depth survey to find out what was on the minds of evangelicals in the U.S. and what is their perception of science and scientists, and does that affect how they receive science and how they interact with science? Meanwhile, independently, Dr. Elaine Howard Eklund from Rice University and her research team were coming up with an idea to do a major survey of several religious groups, including evangelicals and conservative Christians, but other religious communities as well, to understand their perceptions, again, of science. and scientists and so forth. And so we combined efforts and to do a survey, a major survey of several religious groups to find out what they think at some depth about science and scientists, and what they think comes with the package of science, and what their concerns really are, this kind of thing. We're in the midst of that project. The survey has just barely been completed. So Dr. Eklund and her team have been frantically doing preliminary analysis of the data coming in from the survey of several religious groups. She will describe it. And today, hot off the press, you are getting the first preliminary results. Now, the more in-depth analysis, including looking at different demographic comparisons and so forth, will take months into the future. So this is just the opening entree to this. But we wanted to share it with you during the AAAS meeting and go from there because we think it's interesting. And our panel will not only be discussing the preliminary results of the survey today, but perhaps even more importantly, they're going to be talking about why this matters. Why should scientists care about what different religious groups think about them and about science? And we will be actually building on this later in the year to have regional workshops and even a national conference next year where we bring together leaders of the scientific community and religious communities to talk about the results of the survey. The AAAS will be focusing mostly, again, on the evangelical population and what we're learning about them and with them, and Dr. Eklund will be focusing on all of the religious groups being studied. We'll be doing some workshops for several other religious communities as well. So this particular survey and the follow-on publications and workshops and conferences is funded in large part by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation, for which we are grateful, and also support from the AAAS. We're right in the midst of it. We have a wonderful advisory committee, which I will show you in a moment. And we are working with some partners who are helping us do this right, including Gray Matter Consulting, who's helped us with several focus groups to get the questions right for the survey. Public Agenda, which is helping us prepare for these regional workshops that will follow up the survey later this year. The American Scientific Affiliation, which is a network of scientists who are also Christians, some of them evangelicals, helping us understand what the issues are from that middle perspective of people who are both scientists and religious believers, and in particular evangelicals. And then, of course, the National Association of Evangelicals. So this is a very helpful partnership in working up the right kind of project and survey. Our advisory committee consists of leaders in the religious community, pastors, also leaders from the National Association of Evangelicals. Leith Anderson there heads that. We have scientists, bench scientists, we have policy experts, we have scientists who are also working with public engagement and public interactions and public advocacy of science, such as Jeannie Scott, who's on our panel today. We have Jim McCarthy, past president of the AAAS, speaking today on why this matters to scientists. And you'll see the others here. Kay Husbands-Feeling, who is very active in science policy committees and activities all over the country, and she'll be our discussant today. So I think this will be a really interesting conversation today. The project mission is to build more positive understanding between the scientific and religious communities. That's, again, maybe not agreement, but at least if we're having a conversation that's based on reality of what people actually are thinking and perceiving, then at least the conversations can be more productive. Perceptions is what this is about. It's not necessarily what scientists really think and what religious communities really think. This project is trying to figure out what religious people perceive about scientists and science and what scientists perceive about them. So that plays a big role in communication. When it comes to public understanding and support for science from the large and varied sector of religious communities, it is often the perception of the role of science and of scientists themselves. For example, what are their motives, expertise, and influence that often carries the most weight with people as they contemplate the role of science. Likewise, the perception of scientists toward religious communities greatly impact their effectiveness in science engagement. Why is the AAAS particularly interested amongst these several religious groups that we are studying, but in evangelicals? As I mentioned, they constitute nearly 30% of the U.S. population and rank amongst the most religiously conservative communities in the U.S., though perhaps less so than those that are commonly labeled as fundamentalist. But they're also highly concerned about truth, issues of truth, public policy, and so forth. Thus, it is with this community that the greatest improvements and impacts could occur in the science and religion dialogue and the dialogue between the scientific community and the public. Many evangelicals are most concerned, we find from our preliminary studies, not with the individual hot-button issues that make the news headlines, but actually with the package that they perceive science to be delivered in or with. For example, it might not be something like the fossil record or the age of the Earth or the universe that's really troubling people, although that makes the headlines, but rather some perception that evolutionary science implies godlessness, or the concern that, for example, if my child is taught evolution in school, will it become wrapped in a package of atheism or materialism? So it's some of these bigger package issues that we find are actually at the heart of many people's concerns. Just a little overview of where we are in the project. The survey just was recently concluded. As I mentioned, the survey instrument itself was worked on exhaustively over the last year to make sure we get these questions just right, because that's very important when you're doing a survey, is that you ask the right questions, including with multiple consultations with our partnering organizations and advisory committee. Elaine will explain more about the details here. She also did some qualitative interviews, which are very interesting. We're developing a discussion guide and an agenda based on all this for these regional workshops we'll have in 3 parts of the country later this year, and a national conference for evangelical and scientist leaders in early part of 2015. We're also supporting the National Association of Evangelicals as they come up with a booklet called Evangelicals on Science, Questions, Concerns, Confluence. And in fact, they've done a similar excellent type of booklet, which I think they're putting on the table here, not about this, but on climate change for their community, and I applaud them for that positive effort. The desired results are that there would be greater awareness among the general public of the potential for dialogue between science and evangelical Christianity, and to create lasting relationships and equip communities to discuss these issues. These are excerpts taken from the project proposal and description. And to make a notable difference in the target communities include some basic trackable measures, which are going to allow us to see if they indeed do make a difference. So what are those trackable measures? We are doing all kinds of things like all you can do is sort of polls and see if the climate of discussion in these communities changes at all. It'll take some time. Ultimately, it's the building of real relationships between scientists and religious communities that can provide the best bridges of understanding. You see, because if you build ongoing positive relationships, then these dialogues can grow and continue for years into the future, depending on what issues come up. So if you've established positive relationships, then you have a conduit of discussion for challenging scientific and technological issues as they come along, even those we might not be able to predict at this point. Finding out what these groups actually think through a survey is only the first step. Okay, so this is the beginning of what we hope to do, the entree. So with that, I welcome you to the session. Our panelists I will introduce, but let me begin with our first panelist, who is basically the principal investigator of doing the survey, which is Dr. Elaine Howard Eklund from Rice University. Dr. Eklund is a well-known sociologist. She works in many issues relating the concerns and interests of the public in not only to science, but we're most interested in particular to her interests in science and how it is perceived in the public and in the scientific community, and how religion is perceived in the scientific community. So we've been interested in her research for a long time, and now we're glad to collaborate with her and her group. And so, Dr. Eklund, I welcome you to the podium, and I also would welcome someone to help me, since I'm a Mac person and not a PC person, how you get out of one presentation and get into the next one. But maybe you understand that. I'm pressing the escape button, and it's not doing anything. Oh, she's wonderful. Okay, there we go. The plan here is that each speaker will have about 25 minutes, more or less, and then we'll have time at the end of this session, we hope, for a rich Q&A conversation with you. So, so we're hoping to have a lot of rich discussion at the end of this session.
I will. Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming out so early. I want to thank Dr. Jennifer Weissman and the DoSER program for allowing me to partner with them on this project. It's been a huge privilege to work with this group and to try to do research that then will be utilized in some kind of really practical way, hopefully to serve the public's long-term interest. And that's a real privilege for a scholar. That doesn't often happen, and it's wonderful to be part of such an effort. I also want to recognize two people who came with me. Christopher Scheitel, who's sitting in the front row, who is a senior statistical consultant on this project, a research scientist who works with me at Rice University and has worked on much of the analyses that I'll be presenting today, so hugely grateful for his support of this research. And Virginia White, who's a post-baccalaureate fellow with me at Rice and who has managed the qualitative data collection for this project. So I don't know how scientists work. My husband's a particle physicist, so I maybe know a little bit more about that than some people. But social scientists often get their best ideas, I think, from conversations with people. And I would say that I first thought about doing a broad-scale national research project about what scientists, about what religious people think about science when I was doing another research project altogether on religious communities in upstate New York, in the rural part of upstate New York where I'm from. I was in an evangelical congregation attending a Bible study as part of a research project, and a woman that was sitting next to me asked me where I went to school. She thought I was a student. I looked younger at that point. And I said Cornell University, which is where I was, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I hope my child doesn't decide to go to Cornell University." Now, you're all from Chicago, so you know where Cornell University, what it is, right? It's an Ivy League school in the Northeast. So I thought, okay, that's kind of odd. It's a good school. I would think most parents would want their child to get into Cornell University. So I said, well, why don't you want your child to go to Cornell University? And she said, well, I'm really scared that when she gets onto campus that she'll take science classes and all of those scientists will, tell her that they're atheists and try to convince her to become an atheist, and she'll walk away from the faith. And so at that moment, I thought at some point in my career, I want to do some kind of large study that will really discern if this view is typical of evangelicals more broadly, and how does it compare to other religious groups. And so then, quite a few years later, got the opportunity to do that study. So previous studies of the science and religion debates in the social sciences have concentrated in several specific areas. One is this idea of a focus on the perspectives of elite scientists. And some of you may be familiar with some of this work. I have contributed to this work, and a book that I wrote in 2010, Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, was concentrated on the views of scientists who work at the top research universities in the US. And so, interesting study, but very different than this kind of study, and doesn't tell us much about what rank and file scientists think, those who work in industry, those who work outside of those kind of elite academic institutions, those who aren't members of the national academies. I think sometimes because those persons are sometimes the most outspoken, we come to think that their views are typical of all scientists. And so this project helps us get at that a little bit better. Also, previous research that has focused on what religious people think about science has focused mainly on the issue of evolution. That, of course, is an issue, is a science issue that has gotten a lot of press because of very active controversy around the teaching of evolution in public schools, so it makes some sense that we would start there. But what we want to know, I think, as good researchers, if views on evolution, how broad spread the controversy is about teaching evolution, as well as whether or not views on evolution are typical of views on other scientific issues and perhaps the religious public's view on science in general. So here's two questions that we're going to talk about a little bit briefly today. So how do religious people, particularly evangelicals, Jennifer mentioned this need to focus on evangelicals, which I very much agree with as a researcher. What do they think about science? And also, what do rank and file scientists, not just elite and academic scientists, think about religion? And where, in the end, there's the practical output of this research, where is there room for dialogue between religious people, particularly evangelicals, and scientists? So let me talk to you a little bit about the survey that we did. So this is a survey of a nationally representative population. It's a very large population for a survey, so we just recently completed this work. Actually just got the data back in mid-January, so as Jennifer said, we've been working very hard to analyze it. We invited a large group of people to participate, 16,746, which is it's a large survey for a social science survey. We got 10,241 of them to participate, a very good response rate. And for the sake of this presentation today, I'll be talking about the views of 9,138. So that's the population that answered all of the questions that I'm talking about today. Coupled with the survey, a 63% response rate, we also wanted to make sure we got enough scientists in our population to make sure that we would get the views of rank and file scientists. So we did what's called an oversample. We asked more of them to participate than accounts for their actual representation in the general population. Let me talk a little bit about how we define a scientist. So we wanted to get individuals into this survey who were in science-related occupations, including this higher proportion of individuals that are generally considered scientists. So we had to have some way of knowing, having some indication that they're a scientist to even ask them to participate, which got to be a little bit tricky. So these are occupational categories that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics put forth that I would commonly think might include scientists. So we asked people in these particular occupational categories to participate at a greater rate than we asked other persons in the general population. These are also persons who are self-identified as having a science-related occupation. So after we asked them, you might think that people who are in those occupations, who have those occupational classifications, they might be administrators. You might think of like a hospital administrator or something, people who work around science but are not actually scientists. So not that those aren't worthy occupations, but we weren't wanting to consider them scientists. So also ask them, do you define yourself as a scientist? You had the occupational classification, do you define yourself as a scientist? And then we thought, well, to be commonly understood as a scientist, you probably have to have completed at least a bachelor's degree. So we did have some kind of educational cutoff there. And with that whole schematic, we got 574 people in this population who fit these criterion of a scientist. That's about 5% of the sample, which we're very pleased with. That's a good number of people, so eventually we'll be able to do some pretty robust statistical analyses about that. Let me talk to you a little bit about the qualitative data. We also wanted an in-depth understanding of the kind of interface between science and religion for religious people in particular. And so to that end, the team and I conducted 315 in-depth interviews, which is also a very large number of interviews for a qualitative project. That was between June 2011 and January 2014, so that took a very long time to conduct those interviews. They lasted anywhere from an hour to 2.5 hours. I mean, there were people who wanted to talk about this issue so much, we literally had to walk away from them, so, which is unusual in an interview. Usually you're trying to probe and draw them out, so that was exciting for us. We concentrated these interview data collection in 2 cities in the country, Houston, Texas, which is commonly thought of as being a very religious place, and a particular place where evangelicals overrepresented in Chicago, Illinois. Here. And so we looked at individuals in 22 different congregations. These are the congregation types, so Catholics, Episcopalians. The evangelicals in the interview data were from Presbyterian congregations, Baptist congregations, and non-denominational evangelical congregations. We also looked at Jews, both Reform and Orthodox Jews, and Sunni Muslims for the sake of the interview portion of the data collection. This resulted in 142 evangelicals out of the 315 interviews. I won't be going in great depth into the interview data collection, but I'll tell you just a little bit about that. So looking at the religious composition of the general population versus scientists. So let's see. So we have here, from this slide, you see about 23% of our population labels themselves as evangelicals. So these are defined as those stating that evangelical describes them as somewhat or very well. For the purposes of this analysis, we use a self-classification scheme. So there's a large proportion of evangelicals in this population, so we can do a robust analysis from those. I should also draw your attention to the fact that among these rank-and-file scientists, 17% of them think of themselves as evangelicals. So there's also a good proportion of evangelical scientists in this population. But 75% of the whole group of rank-and-file scientists see themselves as religious from some kind of tradition. So those are identity categories. And you see here the over and under representation of particular religious groups in science. So a straight one would be there's the exact same representation in science as there is in the general population. So among evangelicals, you see a little bit of underrepresentation, as well as mainline Protestants and Catholics, some overrepresentation in some other groups, especially in groups from the non-Western religious traditions, which for the sake of this presentation we lump together. Of course, those traditions can't actually be lumped together in any meaningful theological sense. So about 1/5 of the general population, if we look at this entire population, let's just talk about the common story, which is that religion and science are in conflict. And I think as I go through these data, it's going to depend on whether you see the cup half empty or half full. So I'll talk a little bit about the sort of where there is actual conflict. So if you look at the whole general population, 1/5 of the general population perceiving tension between religious communities and scientists. 20% perceive hostility by religious people towards science. We asked them on the survey if they perceive hostility by religious people towards science, and about 20% of a 1/5. And also about 1/5 perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. So there is a perception that there is hostility between these two groups, just in the very broadest sense of categorization. Here's an interview that we did with an evangelical who says, it seems like a scientist who doesn't have faith, who doesn't have any beliefs, it seems like there could be some possibility of disrespect. It seems like the one that has no faith or religion can actually kind of dismiss or wants to dismiss a person who does have faith. It's a lack of respect, I guess, between the two. So that perception of conflict is out there. So also when we look at evangelical Protestants in particular, there is a pretty good perception of conflict too. So this question, when we ask them about how they view the relationship between science and religion, about 1/3 of evangelical Protestants consider there to be a conflict and say, I consider myself to be on the side of religion. You can see down the left side of that table that we also give other kinds of views, which I'll talk about later, other kinds of answer options. So there's also a perception or reality that there's a different religious identities and practices between scientists and between evangelical Protestants. So if you look at, on the left side, the blue are the scientists and the right side are the evangelical Protestants in the population, you'll see that 15% of scientists consider themselves very religious compared to 44% of evangelical Protestants. When we look at attending religious services weekly, which is a measure that sociologists of religion think of as being quite religious, that you're participating in a community at least weekly. So those 42% of evangelicals, 18% of scientists, praying several times a day. 55% of evangelicals, 19% of scientists. Reading religious texts weekly, about 14% of evangelicals and 40% of scientists. No doubts about God. 36% of scientists say they have no doubts about God, and 87% of evangelical Protestants. So there's a difference here. There's a difference here between these two communities, and you can see why there's sometimes some misunderstanding and some discord. How about when we think about evangelical perceptions of hostility? That other statistic I put up now just applied to evangelicals. 12% of evangelicals perceive hostility by religious people towards science. 37% of evangelicals perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. So much greater proportion perceiving hostility by scientists towards religion. Here's a quote from an evangelical we interviewed for the interview data collection who said that, "I think that especially in that field, people would be more apt to find a bone in the ground and say, this is the missing link. This is what proves evolution. We can finally shut up those rotten Christians." So certainly the perception there of some real, malevolent intent almost on the part of scientists. And we'll figure out later whether this is a typical view. So now we're going on to scientists themselves and how they think about the perception of hostility. So 22% of scientists perceive hostility by religious people towards science, and about 24% of scientists perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. 12% of evangelical scientists perceive hostility by religious people towards science, but look at this statistic, 57% of evangelical scientists perceive hostility by scientists towards religion. So that's an interesting statistic, I think. So when we get to the perception of authority, what kind of has authority for science? Where do you go for questions about science? So here's a question we asked of everyone, but I'm just discussing the evangelical population now. With a question about science, evangelicals are just as likely as the general population to consult a person in the scientific occupation. So those who care about the transmission of science to the broader public, that statistic is perhaps a bit dispiriting. So only 14% of the general population is likely to actually consult a real living scientist if they have a question about science. Wikipedia was the most often chosen response. But it's not different for evangelicals. So as relates to this particular dialogue that we're talking about, it's not different for that group. But evangelicals are more than twice as likely as the general population to consult religious sources. So consulting people at their congregation if they have a question about science, 7% versus 3%. A religious leader, 10%, so 1 in 10 evangelicals likely to consult a religious leader with a question about science, and that's a statistic that I think we ought to pay attention to, versus 4% of the general population, and 11% likely to consult a religious text versus 5%, so also more than twice the proportion there. When we get to the evolution issue, we asked a very complicated question about evolution because we wanted to get underneath a variety of perspectives that religious people could have on this issue. So I'll discuss this. There was, I think, 6 perspectives. I'll discuss just the 4 that got the most hits on the survey. So a strict creationism perspective, which is God created the universe, the earth, and all of life within the past 10,000 years. So you see about 22% of the general population compared to 43% of evangelicals. And then when we get a God-guided evolution perspective, so the answer choice read, God created the universe and the earth billions of years ago. God started and has guided human evolution over millions of years. And you see about 18% of the general population and 23% of evangelicals. And the intelligent design perspective, which I was actually surprised that this was so unpopular. The universe and Earth came into billions of years ago, and humans evolved over millions of years according to the design of an intelligent force. And so that, not too much difference between the general population and evangelicals, but a pretty low proportion for both groups. And then natural evolution, the idea that the universe and Earth came into being billions of years ago. All life, including humans, evolved over millions of years. There was no God involved in either the creation or evolution of life. Also, a low proportion of individuals choosing that perspective, an even lower proportion, only about 3% of evangelicals. So I think our team was perhaps surprised that the straight creationism perspective was so popular, but also the God-guided evolution perspective quite popular as well, particularly among evangelicals. So, but let's think about, here's where interview data, actually listening to people's narratives can be particularly useful. The issue of evolution for some evangelicals is not the matter of getting an answer right on a science test. And I think that came out very powerfully when we interviewed people about their views. So here's an excerpt from an interview with an evangelical who said that as a Christian, creation, really it's all or nothing. Either the entire Bible's right or it's all wrong. Either everything inside of it is 100% accurate or none of it is. So if creation could be disproven, take that away, that just devastates my entire way of life, my entire being. And so here we see that what's at stake is a way of life, a sense of meaning, and that is different than just straight science knowledge. And so I think if we're interested in the issue of dialogue, we'll come back to that a little bit later, we have to take that kind of perspective into consideration. Let's look at the possibility of collaboration. And here we do see some real possibilities. So while certainly a large proportion of evangelicals think that religion and science are in conflict, the largest share think that they can collaborate. So 48% giving that answer choice. I was actually surprised by how high that was given the kind of common media reports I hear. I would not as a researcher have expected it to be that high. So collaboration, each can be used to help support the other. Among scientists, also a reasonably high proportion among these rank and file scientists thinking of these two entities as having the potential for some kind of collaboration. And among all respondents, a fairly high proportion. Here's an evangelical talking about how he thinks that religion and science can go hand in hand, saying that science and religion go hand in hand. If you're a scientist and you're working in your field, I just think you get to experience God's presence when you come to work. So to sort of knowing more about God through the natural creation is this person's view. There's also, we see some positive indication of a general interest in science among evangelicals, and meaning that evangelicals are generally as interested in science as the broader public. As persons in this room who care together about science, I think this should be good news. 25% of the general population versus about 20% of evangelicals are very likely to read a full story about a new scientific discovery. 19% of the general public versus 14% of evangelicals have read a science-focused magazine such as National Geographic, Smithsonian, Popular Science, or Scientific American in the last month. I think we ought to want that statistic to be higher, but it's not really appreciably lower for evangelicals. 32% of the general population versus 21% of evangelicals are very interested in new scientific discoveries, so we see a little bit of difference there. So I want to talk for a moment about this evangelical scientist group, which is kind of an interesting group. So how do they experience life as both religious persons and as scientists? So this group is by far the largest to see a sense of collaboration between the two entities. This statistic seems very high to me. 73% have a collaboration view when we ask them how they see the relationship between science and religion. They think each can be used to help support the other. So here's their religious measures. So on the left, we see scientists, then the orange is evangelicals, and then all the way to the right for you are these evangelical scientists. So the yellow is the evangelical scientists. So you see that evangelical scientists are more likely to describe themselves as very religious when compared to even other evangelicals, which we found really fascinating. They're also somewhat more likely to attend religious services weekly. So 54% compared to 42% of evangelicals. They're about the same to pray several times a day. So about 56% for evangelical scientists and 55% for evangelical Protestants generally. And they're somewhat more likely to read religious texts weekly. So perhaps they're just read a lot more in general, but we don't know exactly why that is. But that was somewhat striking to us that 47% read religious texts weekly compared to 41% of evangelicals. They also are about the same proportion say that they have no doubts about God's existence. Here's an evangelical scientist that we interviewed for the sake of the interview research, and he had a nice quote. He said that, "I think that the church needs basically to drop its fear of science. Both the church and science are interested in the truth. Now, they are a little bit different aspects of the truth. Some would say a lot different, but I don't think that either side needs to know the other antagonistically. And I understand how science feels because of some of the past oppressions from the church. So maybe there needs to be a little forgiveness on both sides." Here's some implications. Usually when I give scholarly presentations, I talk about the implications for scholarship, and certainly this research has lots of implications for scholarship. But for this group, let's talk a minute about the possible implications for dialogue between evangelicals and scientists in particular. So many Americans, many evangelicals, and many scientists themselves believe that religion and science can collaborate. So radical collaboration is not something that's likely to be a headline, but maybe it ought to be, that there's more perhaps perception that collaboration can occur than conflict. Those who want dialogue need to consider, I think, the powerful role of religious leaders in the lives of evangelicals. So evangelicals are likely to consult scientific sources of various sorts for information about science, but they're also, this 10% of them, likely to go into religious communities and particularly to consult religious leaders in texts, we think is quite interesting for the role of those communities in the lives of the persons who are part of them, and the role of those communities in a variety of domains of life, even including science. Also, I think there's this interesting group, these evangelical scientists, who themselves may be integral to the mediation or the collaboration process, and we ought to maybe think of them as a type of boundary pioneer of sorts who are able to live well in both of these worlds. And so that's, what could that group do to particularly be helpful in this dialogue is, I think, something that's worth further attention. So again, thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Just if there's any quick burning question.
Burning questions, okay.
We're going to have a lot of time for discussion, but just if there's any quick questions for clarification, let her take one or two, and then we'll move on, and then we'll have more time for discussion at the end. So any sort of quick questions? There's one right up here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Among the people you're defining as scientists, does that include dental hygienists, the person operating the treadmill when I take my stress test?
Probably not, but this, so those persons, that's a complicated question, which is, you never want to lead with that. What? So the question is, are the people you're including as scientists likely to include people like, hygienists, or the person, the technician who operates the treadmill? So we do have like a medical support person in this sort of big occupational category, and we included that as a possibility because that's also likely to include people who work in labs and who would think of themselves as doing scientific research. So I would say that for the purpose of this classification, they would have to be in that occupational category, but also include the perception that they are themselves scientists and have reasonably high education when compared to the rest of the public. And we have also have the ability to write in their actual occupation on the survey as well, but we unfortunately haven't had time to code, and that's an enormous amount of responses to code. So the dental hygienist would not be likely to be included in that group of people, is sort of my bottom line answer, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about how did we get there.
You choose one more, and then we'll...
Boy, it's hard to know. Yeah, here you go.
In the survey literature, it's known that people who choose not to respond or respond partially or respond fully can be systematically different, and they tend to have, those who choose to respond fully tend to have the strongest opinion. So I wonder, because your analysis seems to be based on those respond everything, so should we consider this as really a representation of those who have the strongest opinion, or really about the general population?
No, not really, because so it's also I'm sorry. So the question is, so making a point about survey research, that those who respond fully to surveys perhaps have the strongest opinions when compared to those who have non-response. So asking a question perhaps about, there's lots of ways to think about this, about non-respondent bias in a survey. So there's several different ways to address that. You want to get a reasonably high response rate in general to the whole survey. For analyses for particular papers, it's a very common practice among sociologists to include just the questions for which people respond, so include the people who respond to the particular questions that you're answering. So that's a common practice. Actually, the proportion of people who responded to all these questions is pretty high. So I think we're pretty good along all the ways of thinking about non-respondent bias. But you make a good general point. Is there the possibility that people who respond fully are more likely to feel strongly about things? Yeah. Is that, should I?
Yeah, that's
okay.
good.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Again, we'll hope to have quite a bit of time for discussion at the end, last half hour of this session. So you have to hang around. There you go. Thank you, Elaine, for that very interesting presentation and overview. And I also wanted to mention that defining scientist was a very difficult task for us, because many of us who come from sort of academic backgrounds, we think of scientists as being, people doing active research in an academic lab. But we wanted to use the term scientist for the purposes of this survey and work in the way people in the general public would think of who is a scientist. Who do they perceive as being scientists? And that definition can be much broader. It can include people that are working in many kinds of fields and many kinds of occupations that are science related. And I think that's been an effective way for this study of just defining and using scientists for what we want to learn from it. Our next speaker is Professor James McCarthy. Jim is a professor at Harvard University in biological oceanography. Does all kinds of interesting things out and with the oceans. He's an acting curator in the Museum of Comparative Zoology there at Harvard. He's also a past president of the AAAS and has done very good work in developing relationships and understanding between scientists and evangelicals. He's worked with our DoSER program on some events and projects in the past, and we're grateful to have his observations today on why these kinds of issues and studies should be of interest to scientists in the scientific community. So Jim, we welcome you. Is your presentation loaded here?
No, I'm going to sit. So thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to sit at the...
You don't need it projected?
No.
Okay, very good.
So good morning. Bright and early Sunday morning. I do give public lectures, actually fairly often, and give lectures every week in classes. And this is probably, first one I can remember in decades when I didn't show any slides. So why am I not showing any slides? Because when I show slides, they're all full of data. And then I talk about the data. And the data that we have are Elaine's data, the data we've been looking at. So what I'd like to do this morning is talk a bit about my general interest in this area, some of our experiences, why I think it's important for AAAS to be engaged in this effort, and comment a bit on what Elaine has referred to. And as she said, it's hot off the press. We got a draft of this just days ago, and it's a treasure trove that I'm sure over time will enable us to think more clearly about some of these matters. So why should a topic like this really be of concern to scientists or to our society, this professional society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science? And I think, as Jennifer said in her introductory remarks, when I think of the purpose of this society, this professional society, advancing science and serving society, a big part of that is communicating what we as scientists know to the public, who in many regards, either because of their lack of training or their lack of opportunity to have access to someone who really knows about a particular topic, may have very ill-formed views. And anything we can do in this professional society to better serve society by helping to break down these communication barriers is worth pursuing. And it is one of the reasons that I've been quite interested in this particular initiative. Yesterday at noon, we were at a lunch event, which is called President's Circle. Past, present, and past presidents of AAAS are invited to meet with major donors, people who every year contribute to the resource base of the AAAS with their personal philanthropy. And those funds are used for special projects. And I thought it interesting yesterday that Alan Leshner chose to highlight this particular activity, the activity that is going to link the communication of science with seminary programs, particularly acknowledging with great gratitude the support that has been given by Templeton to this particular effort. And it was interesting that there were several people in the room who commented that this was a very important thing for AAAS to be doing. So scientists are, in order to be successful, they're extraordinarily capable of communicating with other scientists, full stop. People who aren't scientists, for the most part, kind of out of luck. And we saw an extraordinary example of that last evening, if you were at Alan Alda's talk, as he described how poorly we as scientists typically do in communicating the essence of our work. And he of course talked about the importance of trying to get into the mind of the other person, to try and communicate in a way that kind of goes beyond our highly stylistic, the graphs that I would be presenting and the statistical analyses, and how important it is to communicate in the form of stories. He had some video clips of interviews that he had done with people on the street, asking them, and he listed their professions. They were all people with education. They were either students or people who were in professions where some education would have presumably exposed them beyond the high school level to science, and asking questions like, what is physics? What is global warming? Now, I wasn't too surprised that a lot of people didn't know what a quark was. Quark, quirk, quark, quark, quark. But to not even be able to say what they thought global warming was, something that, you know, I spend a lot of time working in this particular field, and we're often trying to communicate really subtle details of what's happening to Earth's climate. And when you realize that for a lot of people, can you say 2 or 3 things about global warming? People just, And that's the way much of the response was. It was, slightly amusing and I would say less embarrassing than a video that was produced at my own university some years ago by our astronomy department on commencement day. Maybe some of you have seen this video where these smart young kids, looking very smart in their caps and gowns, were asked some very, very basic questions about science, as simple as what causes the seasons? And again, not really amusing, but I'd say embarrassing. So we find increasingly, as we talk about climate science, that in order to be effective, we need to tell stories. We need to enable people to understand what this really means. And my God, if you want to see eyes glaze over, show graphs that have some projection of what some aspect of climate might be, temperature, sea level, whatever, 2050 or 2090 or 2100. Who can even, but when you think about it and say, so I'm 70 years old and I have a 10-year-old granddaughter, what's the world going to be like when she's my age? It enables you to have a frame of reference that number on the x-axis no longer just looks like way off in the future, but you can put it in real human terms. And I thought Alan Alda's example last evening in the clip showing a course that he was doing at Stony Brook with a young woman who was talking about the work she was doing on plasticizers and how it could be a problem in children's toys, and just the way he helped her communicate that in a far more powerful way with a very personal story, talking about as if she had a child, what this would mean. So a lot of what we find, though, in our efforts to communicate science is that people need to know, who don't know or understand the science, who may be interested in it, who to trust. Who can you trust? And it so happens, if you just think about it, how many people who are not somewhere around a university setting or some academic center even know a scientist? For a lot of people in the area of climate science, the closest they ever get to thinking that they're in some way understanding what a scientist is saying is what the evening weather person is saying. And we know that most of them are not actually scientists. Many of them are trained in some minimal way in meteorology, and they can stand up and read a script and point to the where the temperature is this and the jet stream's doing that. But for a lot of people, that's the closest they actually get. For a lot of other people, they would turn to perhaps their physician and expect their physician to know and understand something about climate science. And I can tell you in my own experience, a lot of physicians don't even come close to understanding much about climate science. In fact, they often argue that they may know more than climate scientists do, but that's another story. So another experience of mine that I think is worth mentioning is a lot of scientists who are religious never talk about their religion among fellow scientists. It just isn't something that comes up. And sometimes you learn about this in scheduling ways. So all of us who have academic appointments, there's a need to have a conference on something. Well, I teach Monday and Wednesday, yes, and you teach Tuesday and Thursday, and I only teach on Friday, and so, well, how about meeting on the weekend? And you often find that, that's just not possible, because I have other things I have to do in the weekend. And among, the religious traditions, I have colleagues who are Orthodox Jewish, and we just cannot meet on Saturday. That's all there is to it. If it's an observant Roman Catholic, well, maybe you could go to Mass on Saturday or Sunday, so I could meet on Saturday or Sunday. But for others, you say, well, just not a day we can meet. I had an interesting experience some years ago. I was organizing a group of, about 150 scientists. I was heading Working Group 2 for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the late 1990s. And we needed to have a meeting, and there was a window which we constrained by the schedule of having to get the report prepared, and the meeting had to be in December. And we started polling people, and these are from people from 50, 60 nations, and it was one of those years when Ramadan landed in December. And we started blocking off. People said, well, Hanukkah, Christmas, Ramadan, and if you looked at the schedules, there was no way we could get more than about half of the people together on any, and we're going to have travel. We're going to be in actually meeting in Australia. The Australian government's hosting a meeting. People come all around the world, and it was really quite interesting that and they say, well, the people who are not religious who still observe Christmas, but you could do some filtering there, but still there were a lot of people who just could not be away during that period. And certainly, as I said, a lot of scientists don't talk openly about their religious convictions, but it's been interesting at times to see those conversations develop. And one I remember quite poignantly was when I was working with the IPCC. I spent a great deal of time working with Sir John Houghton from the UK. Arguably, at that time, the preeminent climate scientist in England, and learned from him one day that he was very deeply religious, an evangelical Christian. And he, as we talked a bit more about this, he told me he was thinking about organizing a meeting at Oxford during an upcoming summer, and to bring together religious leaders and scientists, climate scientists, to talk about climate science. And I was unable to attend because I had a prior commitment, but I know people who did, whose views were dramatically changed by that experience. And then another very prominent climate scientist in the United States, a picture on the image a bit ago on the slide, Catherine Hayhoe, has actually written a very popular book on this subject. As an evangelical Christian, her husband is a pastor. Catherine is a climate modeler. Her regional downscaled models were a major part of the U.S. National Climate Assessment. I've worked with her extensively in the Union of Concerned Scientists, and this book it goes through a very logical step-by-step discussion about how there's not a conflict between her and her husband. They co-authored the book, their deeply held religious beliefs, and her ability to work as a scientist. I sent her a note a few years ago. I was traveling. I was in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I was in the little airport bookstore, and I saw a copy of her book there, and a stack of them, and I asked the clerk, I said, do you ever sell any of these? She said, oh yeah, boy, we order them all the time, keep it in stock. And she was happy to hear that. Catherine, when I reported that. So Elaine's study had some, as you saw, some fascinating data. I was particularly taken by her finding that, and again, allowing for people who self-identified in the category she calls scientists many of them are not people who would be publishing scientific papers, and not people who would necessarily be at a meeting like this, but they have some level of education, understanding of science, that the total of that group that identified with some religion, 80%, I thought was interesting, and that among those who were scientists, that the evangelicals, the Catholics, the Mormons, and the Protestants were all about the same level, about nominally 4%. The Jews were higher at about 10%. I didn't know how to explain the 14% for Muslims, Hindu, and Buddhists. That really surprised me. But among the observations that I really found most interesting were those that, on the glass half full side, that thought there were opportunities and we should look for ways to cooperate and collaborate on better understanding communication of science and showing that it is not necessarily in conflict with the religion. I'll say a little more about that conflict in a moment. But I'd like to refer back to my first serious interaction of this sort. And I'm glad to see Randy here today because not only is he involved in this effort, but he and I had this extraordinary opportunity about a half a dozen years ago through with the support of an anonymous donor. A long weekend meeting was convened at a secluded retreat environment in Georgia. And there were about a dozen scientists and about a dozen religious leaders, evangelical religious leaders. There were presidents of colleges, there were heads of seminaries, there were pastors of megachurches. Most of them, there were a few exceptions, most of them had no background in science. The scientists who joined this effort included good representation from AAAS, past presidents Rita Caldwell and Peter Raven, other kind of household names in climate science, Jim Hansen, in sort of the world of biodiversity and conservation, people like Nancy Knowlton, Carl Safina, E.O. Wilson. It was a gathering that I think all of us went to full of curiosity. All of us, I mean the scientists and I helped recruit this group, and not really knowing what would come of it. And as we all left, I think we felt nothing but astonishment. So that first evening, as we sat together, Randy, I'll never forget those conversations. As we sat, and it was around a table, but it was literally on two sides of the table, just the way we kind of gathered. And we started talking about what's important to each of us, what we think of when we think of the natural world, how we relate personally to the natural world. It was interesting how many of us could remember experiences as children, discovering something in nature that really crystallized and is profoundly important in shaping our views about the natural world and relations between humans and other organisms. And at one point, from the other side of the table came a comment that said, well, you scientists, you're talking in spiritual terms. I just didn't ever imagine that I'd hear anything like this. It was, I mean, I still remember vividly parts of those conversations that were so moving. So the focus was largely on the question of climate science. And I'd like to just read a few words from the statement we prepared at the end of this conference. And then we held an event a few months later at the National Press Club to talk about this coming together. So I'm just going to read a few lines here from the summary. It said, "We happily discovered far more concordance than any of us had expected, quickly moving beyond dialogue to a sense of shared moral purpose." And then this statement, "We clearly share a moral passion and sense of vocation to save the imperiled living world before our damage to it, remake it as another kind of planet. We share a profound moral obligation to work together." A little further in this short document, "We agree that our home, Earth, which comes to us as that inexpressibly beautiful and mysterious gift that sustains our very lives, is seriously imperiled by human behavior." And further, that a new moral awakening to a compelling demand, clearly articulated in Scripture and supported by science, that we must steward the natural world in order to preserve for ourselves and future generations a beautiful, rich, and healthful environment. For many of us, this is a religious obligation rooted in our sense of gratitude for creation and reverence for its creator. Now, there was some hesitancy when this was being drafted on the part of the person who was guiding this from the evangelical side about whether the scientists would even accept this document if it had the word creator or creation in it. And we said, no, there's no problem with that. So here's the final line from this document. We pledge to work together at every level to lead our nation towards a responsible care for creation, and we call with one voice to our scientific and evangelical colleagues and to all others to join us in these efforts. Now, this effort continues with occasional, initially they were more frequent, but as we established good working relationships, opportunities for scientists, for these climate scientists, to review any of the documents that the National Evangelical Association of Evangelicals would send out with anything about climate science. Their statement was, we want to make sure our 40,000 pastors are well informed, they're not confused by going to the internet and trying to figure it out on their own. So this, for I think all of my science colleagues who participated in this, was a remarkable opening of a dialogue and discussion. And when those of us who were together at this session see each other at different places, we greet each other like the warmest of friends, and we all remember how profoundly that opportunity shaped views that we still hold today. I want to say just a few things before concluding here about conflict. And this was the part, I mean, I was intrigued by the collaboration and cooperation statements that nearly 50% of the evangelicals say that the relationship between religion and science is one of collaboration. I think I'm happy to hear that. But on the conflict side, it's in my estimation, often not a conflict about the science, but a conflict about how the understanding from science might be used or is being proposed for use. And I can give you and you can probably all think of examples of that, but I can give you one that I found interesting in the area of climate change. So if we look at the projections for what climate scientists call business as usual scenarios, just keep doing what we're doing today, 80% fossil fuel, energy-based going forward, all the carbon dioxide from that accumulating in the atmosphere and what that do with climate, we realize that not only will there be substantial changes on the aspects of climate that affect people, whether it's sea level rise or temperature or changes in extreme events, affect our agricultural systems, affect our infrastructure, affect for many communities of organisms, the survival of some species for sure. The other realization, and this is something I was involved in bringing awareness to in the late 90s, early 2000s with our IPCC work, is the people who are going to be most affected by this are not us sitting in this room, unless we've got a beach cottage that's really very close to high water today. It's going to be the poorest people on the planet. And this is something that really came through with enormous sense of compassion and emotion in our meeting in Georgia that I referred to earlier. That it's the least among us who are going to be most affected by that, in the sense of moral obligation to do what we can to keep that from happening. So if you look at everything that I could tell you today, if I could talk to you about climate science, you'd say, well, we must put the brakes on. But I have colleagues, and one of them deeply religious, who believes so passionately that we must today more effectively deal with the problems of poverty worldwide, and that it's actually, in his way of thinking, more important to do whatever we can to provide reliable sources of energy in parts of the developing world where it would make a huge difference in terms of access to clean water, in terms of irrigation for crops. And that if that means we're continuing to contribute with the dirtiest forms of electric generation, coal-fired power plants, let's say, that we should not do anything that would diminish the likelihood of that, even if it is going to make the climate problem worse. So if you would look at now not just what science tells us, but what policies one might want to advocate as an informed citizen with knowledge of that science, he would come down very differently from a lot of us. He would say it's more important that we deal with those problems now, and we'll have to work harder in the future. Everyone knows that, to deal with the climate problem. But he would not today do anything that would cut back on access to, even that would, diminish investments. As the World Bank has just said, they're no longer going to invest in coal-fired power plants in the developing world. Well, he would strongly oppose that because he thinks that it's more important. So that's a somewhat benign example, but I think in many cases what is perceived as conflict is not necessarily the science per se, but how that information would be used. So I'm really quite pleased by the scholarship that has gone into this effort. I look forward to seeing what Elaine and her colleagues are able to mine from this. I think also, as Jennifer mentioned at the beginning, these workshops that are being planned are, in my way of thinking, a great initiative for AAAS. And I'll just conclude by, again, thanking you all for coming and point out that a couple of years ago when we had the first symposium at a AAAS meeting that had the word religion in the title, there were a few members of this professional society who thought that was an absurd thing. That doesn't belong at this meeting. Well, when we saw the room in that first session overfilled, we realized that it's a good thing. And thank you for coming, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was moving and interesting. Would you be willing to take a question or two? And then, of course, again, we'll have a longer discussion session later. There's a question back here.
I'll look it up and I'll have it for you. Sorry?
Well, there were two. There's the booklet, A Climate for Change, which I think is the NAE booklet. No.
Catherine?
Oh, Catherine's. Okay, I'm sorry.
Can you repeat it?
A Climate for Change by Catherine Hayhoe. Is that the
Yes.
book you referred to? Okay,
Yeah.
right. Okay.
I was hoping you could lead me to where I could find the text that you quoted so extensively from your working group or that meeting.
Sure. I'll tell you what. Is that something we could put on the DoSER website?
I think so. Sure.
Yeah. So let's put it there. It's the title of it was a call for action, and it's this short document. It has the signatures of all the attendees at the bottom, and it's what we presented at the National Press Club. And I could give you a video link. I know that the presentations that each of us gave that day at the National Press Club are still on a website. And
So maybe
if
we
you
can
want
put a
to
link,
that.
put a link to
Yeah.
this from our
Okay.
site or something. So
What is the website you're referring to?
We can link it on the DoSER website.
You must know how to find it now.
On the what website? I'm not familiar with the acronym.
Oh, I'm sorry. Our program is the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DoSER, D-O-S-E-R program within the AAAS. But we would just be linking to whatever website that you are referring to. So if there's a way she can go directly there, it'd be faster.
If you want to see me afterwards, I'll
Yeah,
write it out
that's
for
probably
you.
the
I've
more
got it here.
efficient way of doing it.
I've got it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, any more quick questions right now, or we'll go on to the next speaker and we will have richer discussion toward the end? All right, thank you very much, Jim. That was a wonderful presentation.
No slides, I can't believe I did it.
Yeah, yeah. All right, now we move to the perspective of the evangelical Christian community regarding the survey and science and why this matters. So I'd like to welcome Galen Carey from the National Association of Evangelicals. He's the Vice President for Government Relations. He's responsible for representing the NAE before Congress, the White House, and the courts. This association represents more than 45,000 local churches from 40 different denominations and serves a constituency of millions. And before joining the staff, Galen was an employee of World Relief, which is a relief and development arm of the NAE. So Galen, please welcome yourself to the podium here, and if you can help me find your presentation. And are you using slides?
Yes, I have
Okay.
some slides.
Okay. Do you remember what it was called? Okay. If someone, yeah, I can't. If someone who knows how to use this kind of computer so that I can see a mouse, which I don't.
First, yeah, we don't see.
Oh,
there, yeah.
there you go. Okay. This is dialogue between not only science and religion, but between Macs and PCs. Okay, we got it. All right.
But it's not.
Oh, but how do you get it to go up there? He did something over here, which could, yeah. How did you?
There's a, usually there's a control function like that that'll do it.
Well, he did something down here, which.
Here we have
Oh,
this one
yes. How do we get?
here. This one right there.
Okay. Ah, so
There we go.
simple. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Before I start, just have one question for you all. Since this is Sunday morning, why aren't you all in church? Well, I'll tell you why I'm not in church, and that's because I was invited here to the AAAS. And when I got the invitation, I was very excited to come because I love interacting with scientists. You're such interesting people. But also because Chicago at one time was my hometown, so I was looking forward to going to visit my old church, which is not that far from here, while I was in town. But then, of course, I found out that time that we all are meeting and the time that they're meeting is exactly the same time. So, well, that's fine. So I want to begin with a thank you. Thank you to all of you who are scientists for all that you do to extend the frontiers of human knowledge. We talk about conflict sometimes with science, but representing evangelical Christians, we also have a great deal of appreciation for all that you do, for helping to make our lives much richer and contributing to the general human flourishing, which is also part of our goal as well. I spent much of my life in working, as Jennifer said, in relief and development work, working with the poor. And I've been interested to see here at this conference that there's been talk about what to do about famine in Africa, and about humane treatment of prisoners, about what to do about helping the unemployed, caring for the sick, treating the addicted. So these are all things that evangelicals also care about deeply, and we have met so many common concerns. So I want to ask, first of all, we know that many evangelicals are part of the scientific world, but do any of you know who the first evangelical science was? I'll give you a hint. His first name was Tom. Well, before Aquinas. I don't know if Aquinas was a scientist or not, but anyway, here I've brought a picture of him. I don't know if you appreciate the Italian painter Caravaggio. He gives us this beautiful scene where Thomas, who had not been present when Jesus appeared to some of the other disciples, and he said, I want some evidence. And so unless I can actually put my finger into the place where the nail went through his hand, unless I can touch his side where the spear had gone into his side, I will not believe. And so Thomas pursued the evidence, and he actually did meet the risen Christ and came to believe. So I hope that will encourage some of you. But I want to also ask you another question, which is, how do you define evangelical? And I actually want you to take a piece of paper or your notepad and actually write. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, so you have to do this quickly, but write. Now, what is an evangelical? Okay? Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do something that we often do in church as well, and that is turn to your neighbor and share your definition with somebody that's nearby. All right, that's enough fun. Would 2 or 3 people care to just share your definition with the group? Just speak it out in a loud voice. All right, one who shares the good news. Good. What else?
Telling the gospel story.
Telling the gospel story. Good.
Faith over works.
Faith over works. Personal relationship with Christ.
Somebody who screams about their God.
Someone who screams about their God. All right. Anyone else?
Somebody who believes that the Bible is literally true.
Someone who believes the Bible is literally true. Okay. A cultural group with specific beliefs about Jesus. All right. Well, I'll give you the NAE's elevator definition. We actually have a bunch of material on our website, which you're welcome to look at. But if somebody stops me in the elevator, this is what I say. Evangelicals take the Bible seriously and believe in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. Now, admittedly, the definition is a bit broad, and it probably encompasses some people who may not embrace the evangelical label. But it captures the few things that are really important to us, that most of which have been brought out in things that you've shared. There is this personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and it's a relationship that involves both salvation and discipleship, or being Savior and Lord. It means it's something that comprehensively affects everything that we do. We take the Bible seriously, and that word literally often is problematic, and there's a lot more to it than I have time to go into now in terms of what that means and how we look at that. But we definitely take hermeneutics seriously as well. So next question, is evangelicalism a religion? A lot of people say yes, and I don't want to quibble about that in a sociological sense. Certainly we have belief in a supreme being, we have a moral code, we have creeds and rites and rituals and things that you normally associate with religion. But among evangelicals, there's also a strong sense in which we don't consider ourselves to be a religion. You could say as well that we are, in one sense, a renewal movement within the broader Christian community. But as well, evangelicals, when they talk about religion, typically will say that religion is human beings reaching toward God, trying to find the ultimate. Whereas what we have found our faith to be about is actually responding to God reaching down to us. And it's not about religion per se. And so when some of the research about, when you ask questions about religion, that's something we need to keep in mind. Well, I'll just share a little bit about some of the historical roots of the evangelical movement. John Wycliffe, one of the first to begin translating the Bible into English, which was one of the precursors to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, with Luther and Calvin and others. In fact, Luther called his German church the evangelical church, and to this day in Germany, the word evangelical basically means Lutheran. So that's one of the sort of historical meanings. But then in the American context, through the 18th and 19th century, there were several great awakenings, mass revival movements which profoundly affected the development of our nation and resulted in the evangelical church that we have today. And people such as Whitefield, John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards, some of the leaders in those movements. And then in the 20th century, at the turn of the 20th century, the Pentecostal movement was born, which today is the fastest growing part of the evangelical movement, not just in the U.S., but around the world. The Assemblies of God, which is the largest member denomination in the NAE, has about 60 million members worldwide. And they project by 2020 that they will have 100 million. So very fast growing. Then there's a charismatic movement which started in the 60s, which is more a renewal movement within denominations, but shares many characteristics with the Pentecostal movement. So it's a diverse movement that has strong roots in the American experience. Now, in the early to middle part of the 20th century, in the Christian community, there was a basic divergence between one group who began to focus more on what is often called the social gospel, looking at human betterment and how to improve social conditions, and partly in reaction to that, a fundamentalist movement which became very concerned about theological purity, but not really wanting to engage much with the outside. But there were a group of evangelicals who were looking for a middle way. That is, they wanted to maintain their theological integrity for sure, and they believed that many of the social gospel leaders had abandoned critical elements of faith. But they didn't want to go down the fundamentalist road. They wanted to be able to cooperate broadly across denominations. They wanted to be engaged with society because, after all, they saw that that was part of their mission. And so those people came together in 1942 to found the National Association of Evangelicals. It was founded right in the middle of World War II, which doesn't seem like a propitious time to be starting a new organization. But in fact, some of the turmoil around that time actually, I think, brought people together. Today, the NE, as already been said, brings together 40 denominations of all different theological types, the Pentecostal, the Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, and many others, as well as many non-denominational congregations, some of them very large, some as large as denominations, actually. and then a whole range of other evangelical organizations and institutions and networks like colleges and universities and seminaries and missions and relief networks and publishers. We have a very broad and decentralized community. It's also a dynamic community. It's one that, as other parts of the Christian church have, at least in numerical terms, stagnated or even somewhat declined, it's a community that continues to grow, to reach out, and as I said, very diverse. David Bebbington gives us perhaps one of the most commonly known criteria for a theological definition of evangelicalism, and he points out 4 points. Conversionism, the idea that lives must change, that we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, as Paul says to the Christians in Rome. And so there needs to be a point of conversion. And I'm one of those people that if I had been in the survey and I was asked, does the term evangelical describe you somewhat or very well, I would have said very well. I had a moment in my life where I knelt down by a couch with my mother and prayed to turn my life over to God. And that moment, more than 50 years ago now, has continued to guide my spiritual development throughout my life. So that's very important to us as evangelicals. There's also this element of activism, that we are not supposed to be withdrawn from the world. We are supposed to be engaged, making an influence in every part of society. And of course, that would include scientific exploration and discovery as well. Then the focus on the Bible, which is critical, because we see the Bible as being God's revelation to us and the source of not only nourishment, but also guidance in all that we do. And we don't read the Bible literally, if you mean by that when the psalm says that God is a rock, we don't turn to a geologist for an explanation. We understand that there are different forms of literature and all the rules of hermeneutics that must be followed. But once having seriously studied and understood the Bible's message, we believe that we are accountable to it. We can't set it aside in case we happen to disagree with it. It has to guide, it's a moral code that has to guide all that we do. And then finally, crucicentrism, the fact that the death and resurrection of Jesus is at the heart of our faith, that our faith really would mean nothing if Jesus had not actually lived, died, and rose again. So that's, of course, a truth that's shared in many branches of the Christian faith, but it's one that's particularly central in evangelical belief. Now we go to thinking about how do we measure the prevalence of evangelical faith in the country. There's many different ways, and George Barna, who's an evangelical pollster, has come up with a 9-point test, and you don't have to read them all. The researchers really don't like this because it takes about 20 minutes to go through the whole thing before you even find out if this is a person you want to ask your other questions to. So it's not very practical. By his count, only about 8% of Americans are pure evangelicals that believe all those things. As you've already heard in the Rice study, as in many studies, they used a self-description, or in the case of the survey, and look at beliefs and affiliation in the case of the interviews, and those are both commonly used. Some of the problems, of course, is that we do have this amorphous group, and evangelicals are found in every Christian denomination, not just the ones that are labeled evangelical. And so you get this problem sometimes of including people who don't possibly belong in the group that you're trying to study, and on the other hand, excluding some who do belong, and that's particularly problematic. In many pollsters, for reasons that make sense to them, don't believe that African Americans can be evangelical, which we actually happen to believe that they can, but in many cases they're excluded from the numbers, at least for analysis purposes. So when you look at some different numbers that pollsters have come up with. Gallup has been asking for a long time a general question: would you say that you are an evangelical or a born-again Christian? And the numbers have varied between the 30s to the high 40s, but somewhere around 40% of Americans will embrace that. Notice that Gallup includes the term born again, which captures some people that don't embrace the evangelical label. For example, in the Southern Baptist Church, the second largest church in the country, something like a quarter of the people don't embrace the evangelical label, but we would consider them to be part of our community, and clearly. The Pew numbers come up about 33%, but then, as I say, they exclude the African Americans, so that gives them a number of 26%, and I told you the other numbers. To put that in a context, the other parts of the religious landscape, Catholics are about 24%, and mainline Protestant about 18%, and then the unaffiliated about 16%. So you see the evangelicals, however you want to define and label them, represent probably the largest single block of religious believers, or block of Americans, when you look at religious category. So definitely a group worth spending some time thinking about. Now, there are 9 states in which evangelicals represent a majority of the population, more than 50%. The first column is, by the way, these are Pew's numbers. The first column excludes African Americans. The second column includes them. So you notice that all these states are in the southeast. Then there are 7 states that have 15% or less. So every state, almost every state except for these 7 have more than 15%. And you'll see that aside from Utah and Nevada, the least evangelical states are all in New England. All right, now I want to just talk briefly about a few challenges that I see in this as we try to get our 2 groups coming together. I'll talk a little bit about ignorance, about politicization, incivility, and intolerance. So I want to start with evangelicals, because as Jesus said, before you help your neighbor take the speck out of their eye, you first take the log out of your own eye. So we recognize that we have some issues in our community. The survey pointed out there's somewhat lower science education and participation rates in our community. And we have to acknowledge there is an anti-intellectual strain. I would argue that it's not the main part of our community. And when you look at what passes for general entertainment in our country, you can wonder if we're much different from the general population. But that has been an issue at times. There's also our belief in revelation sometimes is taken to preempt discovery. And in fact, we don't. It ought not to be that way, because we know that God made us with minds so that we could explore, and actually it's part of being responsible to love God with our minds is to explore. But sometimes the revelation is taken to trump that in an unhelpful way. We sometimes have an undue trust in religious leaders. I say undue because we look to our religious leaders for guidance in things where they don't know very much, has been pointed out. Many times we'll turn to a pastor with a scientific question, and there are, I know some pastors who have PhDs in science, but that's not the norm. And so sometimes we're not looking in the right places, and there's reasons for that, which we go into. And then there's, in some cases, there is a willful rejection of inconvenient truths. There's things that don't seem to fit well either with our theology or with our politics, and we say, well, no, that can't be true because we don't like where that takes us. And of course, that's things that need to be addressed. Now, on the part of scientists, in some cases we see inadequate religious education or awareness. That is, if part of being a scientist is discovering truth, part of the truth is knowing about the people that you're communicating with. And in some cases, there's gaps there that could also be addressed. and as well, and sometimes an inadequate reflection on the history and philosophy of science. And of course, evangelicals and Christians more generally have contributed a great deal to the advancement of science. And this idea that the scientific enterprise doesn't need to be packaged in a non-religious or atheistic wrapping is very important, and sometimes those things get confused. There's a website I saw recently that talked about promoting science and secular values. So then the question one has to ask is, well, what secular values ought science to be promoting, and why these and not those? And there are some secular values that make sense and others, to me, that don't. And so the inappropriate blending of those things sometimes can be problematic. And then there can be an over-reliance on media stereotypes. And of course, the media likes to take the worst cases and the loudest, and the ones who are screaming, I think someone said the word screaming, or shouting at least. And so those are taken then to be representative of a large group of people in ways that probably are not accurate. Now, politicization is a big issue. It's an issue, of course, for our politics more broadly, and I spend most of my time in Washington, D.C., so this is my life. But the loudest voices we know are not always the most representative or the most helpful. And many times scientific issues become politicized because we start talking not just about what are the facts that we're discovering and what's the new insights, but then what ought to be done about those, which brings us into a different area. And of course, the area of climate is a prime example of that. And in the focus groups that were done preparatory to the survey, there was some discussion about climate that I found very interesting, because when you ask people, just evangelical rank and file, about what they see as scientific issues and in the interface of religion and science, climate really doesn't come up that much. And the reason is that many people don't see this as a religious issue. They see it as a political issue. There's people who want to take our freedom away, people who want more government regulation and wants to pay more for our gas and things like that. And so that is what people then react to, and not so much the science. The science is a step removed from that. So to address some of those questions, we produced this booklet. It's called Loving the Least of These, Addressing a Changing Environment at the NAE, and we offer this to our members as a discussion paper that helps to look at some of the science, but then also using the frame of how do these issues impact people that we care deeply about, the poorest people in the world. And Jesus told us that the way in which we respond to the poorest people in the world is really how we are responding to him. So it's very important to evangelicals, and evangelicals spend a great deal of time and effort reaching out to poor. In fact, that was the main part of my life's work before I came to the NAE. So there's a few of these I put in the back, but it's just as many as I could fit in my briefcase. But this is available for a free download on our website, and you can also order copies. So welcome to that. Many times I think both believers and scientists become co-opted by political forces, and they're people with agendas that don't necessarily serve either groups. They will look for scientists to push their agenda, or they look for religious people to push their agenda, and sometimes that pushes us into conflict that really need not be there, and it very much impedes the kind of honest conversation and truth-seeking that Professor McCarthy was talking to us about, that we need to have a lot more of. All right, just briefly, an incivility, the fact that oftentimes we don't do a very good job of listening to each other, and listening is such an important skill to discovering truth and to building relationships. And then we sometimes move from there into name calling because we haven't really heard the person, so we just give them a name. And then that really is a form of disrespect. And if you think about it, when was the last time that you changed your mind about something because you talked with someone who disrespected you? and they convinced you. It doesn't work that way, does it? And then finally, a couple of words about intolerance. On the evangelical side, again, there are issues. We have issues in some of our academic institutions where there are policies related to scientific inquiry which limit the freedom of our scientists to explore and to try to find out what's actually is. And those are sometimes driven by theological concerns. More often it's a financial matter that donors may not give money if we don't, if we see that they see that some of our people are pushing the boundaries a bit too much. So that's an issue for evangelicals. Also, attacks on fellow believers due to their positions on science. Sometimes we do eat our own young, and sometimes we attack each other more viciously than even people from the outside. On the scientific side, you share in general with our academic world in general, and even more broadly, our society has taken a very high interest in tolerance, and intolerance is perhaps the worst sin. I think it's worse than adultery for sure. In the public ranking of sins, it's got to be one of the worst in the modern mind. And so, people want you to be tolerant to everyone except to people who are seen to be intolerant. And so it's perfectly acceptable to be intolerant toward intolerance. And this oftentimes then becomes an issue in our community, because evangelicals are people that have clear and well thought out beliefs about things which sometimes bump up against modern notions of tolerance. And so we ask then, is there a place for evangelicals at the table or do we have to leave our religion at the door before we come to sit and talk with other people? The assumption that believers are irrational and have nothing to contribute, because if they were smarter, why would they believe those foolish things that they do? Sometimes using science as a way of attacking religion, and again, there's sometimes a lack of thoughtfulness about the fact that all people, including scientists, have first principles, and those first principles come from somewhere, and they didn't come from a laboratory. Right? So there's some basic ideas that we have about how the world is and how we can explore, and sometimes those are used to attack religion. And then there is this issue of discrimination. I talked with a number of evangelical scientists in preparing for my presentation this morning, and one person in particular said he teaches at a Christian college, and he said when he talks with his seniors who are getting ready to apply to graduate schools, he advises them to be rather circumspect about their faith commitments. He said, if you've been on a mission trip, maybe call it a sustainable development trip or something, so that, because you never know, and it may not be the majority, but there are some people who just have it in for religious people, and so they may toss out your application or for admission, or professors who are seeking tenure or promotions and all these things. And so it's an appeal to scientists to respect and give the same consideration to evangelical scientists, your colleagues and believers, as you would to any other group. All right, now just a bit about some opportunities I see. There's some assets we can talk about. Some have already been mentioned. The ambassadors and some actions we could take in a few areas for advocacy. First of all, as the survey showed very clearly, many evangelicals respect science and appreciate its contributions. And by the same token, many scientists respect religion and appreciate its contributions. So that's something to build on, certainly. Also, from the evangelical side, as has been pointed out, we are oriented to truth. Following St. Augustine, we believe that all truth is God's truth. And so we're not or shouldn't be worried about the further exploration of God's world, because that can only increase our understanding of the world that God made. And then, as we mentioned, the more than 2 million evangelical scientists who can serve as bridge builders. That's a large number of people And we can think about these people as ambassadors. And I think it would be good for us to know more than we know now about where those people are, in what disciplines and what areas, and perhaps to convene some discipline-specific dialogues in, what do engineers or physicists or others specifically have to contribute to the evangelical science dialogue. Some of the evangelical scientists are very committed believers, as the survey showed, but in most cases they may not have theological training, and so they may not be the best ambassadors from the evangelical side, and so providing some of them with some more specialized theological training so they could be better bridge builders would be helpful. And then to support groups like the ASA, the American Scientific Affiliation that Randy leads, and groups like that can play an important role in bringing together Christian and evangelical scientists so that they can then promote better understanding in their own community and better understanding with other scientists. All right, dialogues such as the ones that are being planned are very helpful, but we need a lot more than what DoSER is going to be able to field. And so some of you maybe could help to organize some dialogues in your local communities or in your institutions. Take a pastor to Starbucks, maybe get to know some, get some informal dialogues, and confidence building would be really helpful. And maybe even think of a way that you could invite a pastor to come and speak in one of your classes, and maybe they will invite you to come and speak in the church. To start building those bridges, identify shared interests. In the ethics area, I think it's good if we could start with some of the less controversial areas, supporting funding for science, which is always an issue, I know. The partnerships for international development, I heard several of them being talked about this weekend at the conference, some very interesting initiatives. We are right now doing a lot of work on immigration reform, and that's important to scientists because so many of your graduates have trouble staying here in the country, so supporting visas for the STEM students and graduates and immigrants. Things like clean air and clean water are very important to evangelicals, and science, of course, is involved in that. Just one example, last year we worked with the Evangelical Environmental Network on promoting the EPA's mercury rules for new power plants, which will help health in general, but in particular, we noted that less mercury in the atmosphere and the environment would be especially good for pregnant women and for their unborn children. So there's a pro-life dimension here to care of God's creation that we're able to highlight, and that helped to build some support for something that was important to many people. And many similarly other public health concerns. Evangelicals tend to have a very high regard for medical science and people who are involved in promoting health, so I think that's an area where we could build bridges. Then finally, addressing controversy, show respect. Humility is a really good virtue to cultivate. Evangelicals believe that all people are fallen, and so we realize that we're fallible, we're finite, and sometimes we are just plain wrong. And so we need to recognize that, and scientists, sometimes, as I understand, scientists have occasionally changed their theories or their beliefs on things when they got some new information. So it's good to focus on that. Integrity is important. Many of you, I'm sure, read the Economist article a few months ago, How Science Goes Wrong, which talked about the issue that sometimes the data that's reported in peer-reviewed journals isn't accurate and can't be replicated, and sometimes it's been through just careless mistakes, and more or less frequently probably it's a matter of fraud. But there's competition for research dollars, and nobody gets a lot of kudos for replicating someone else's experiment. So there's lots of reasons or ways in which science can work on strengthening integrity. And on the evangelical side, we also need to be careful about things that we say about, especially about science, that we don't know much about, and we should be not so quick to reject findings just because we may not like them. And finally, we should all have patience because this, as in any relationship, takes time to build, and it's sometimes easier to destroy than to build. So let's try not to do things that destroy the relationship, and let's work hard to build it up. As I said, our document is available for download, and maybe a few copies back there. And then finally, I'll leave you with this. As an evangelical, my deepest desire would be each of you would come to consider the claims of Jesus, which is a matter of concern not just about the science relationship, but affects all of life. There's a lot of evidence to be considered. If you haven't considered it, please do, and I'd be happy to talk with you more offline about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move to our next speaker, and then we'll hopefully have time after that for our discussant and to have a fuller discussion. I am going to need some help. Okay. So I appreciate, Galen, also your constructive ideas for going forward. I think that's very helpful. I don't know how you close the present.
Fret not,
Okay.
I'm just finding the mouse, that's
Yeah,
all.
that's...
You go ahead and say nice
Okay,
things about me.
all right, I'm going to say nice things. Our next speaker actually almost needs no introduction. I'm sure all of you know well the good work of Eugenie Scott. Jeannie is an American physical anthropologist and a former professor. She's known as one of the strongest voices advocating for the teaching of science, challenging the teaching of creationism in public schools. And she's most well known in recent years for having served as the director of the executive director of the National Center for Science Education for many years. And she's just now retiring from that position, and she continues to serve with them, however, as the chair of NCSC's Advisory Council. Jeannie has been a strong advocate for science for many, many years, and advocating and protecting the teaching of science in many different environments. She's also, through her organization, had a lot of chance to interact with different segments of the public, including the religious public, about science and about science understanding and exchange. She's had so many experiences that we consider her a unique treasure to help us at the AAAS understand how better to interact with the public. She is on the advisory council for this particular survey project, and we welcome you, Jeannie, to give us some advice for us as a science community based on what you've learned from your experience and what we're learning from the survey of how to build better dialogue between science and religious communities. So thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you. You really did say nice things about me, thank you. In the program, the title of my talk is a lot longer: Equipping Scientists to Better Understand and Converse with Religious Communities. Because my time is limited, I'm going to address a subset of both of those. A branch of scientists well represented at AAAS, those who are professors and who teach, and the religious communities, but in general, student populations, rather than a wider, there are many, many issues to consider in this. Most students in the United States are religious because most Americans are religious. The unaffiliated, the green wedge in this diagram, are 16%, but this does not mean that 16% of Americans are atheists. The unaffiliated are a mixed group. Some are secular and some are religious. The nothing in particular -religious is a substantial part of that unaffiliated group, 5.8%. If you add up the secular nothings and those who identify themselves specifically as atheists or agnostics, you get about 10% of Americans who are non-believers, and that number has been pretty stable for decades. Well, what about scientists? Eklund and Scheidl's research suggests that about a third of natural scientists at elite institutions believe in God or a higher power, somewhat fewer social scientists. Other research has shown that the percentage of professors, which is scientists and non-scientists, with these beliefs increases in, shall we say, less elite institutions and is highest in community colleges. This is probably the case with scientists as well. And we've just seen that in rank and file scientists, the percentage is even higher. Data show that the percentage of scientists who are believers is considerably lower than that of the public as a whole, but it is not zero, which is a common misconception. And unfortunately, if I may editorialize a tad, I have seen in presentations in this symposium this juxtaposition of scientists and believers. That's the wrong juxtaposition, and that's one of the messages that I have today. It's not zero, but it's probably much lower than the percentage of adherence to religion in the student body. Students come from a variety of religious backgrounds in most public institutions. Some of them come from denominations that do not encourage critical thought, especially about religion, and the previous speaker has mentioned this as well. Students from such denominations may be wary of studying science at all because science is held up as antithetical to religion. Proponents of creation science, for example, hold that there is a dichotomous choice between creation and evolution. No intermediate positions are recognized as valid. Similar views may be held of science in general, that science is inherently toxic to religion, and students should avoid being exposed to science for fear of losing their faith, and we heard an anecdote about that this morning. These views are held by some atheist scientists as well. But whatever the source, if students are presented with a dichotomous view, that one must choose between science and religion or evolution and creationism, the door effectively is shut to further scientific understanding. Professors should be aware of this perception and avoid exacerbating it. As it happens, the dichotomous view is empirically wrong. As we've seen, there are plenty of examples both inside and outside of science of individuals who fully accept science as well as retaining faith. This is not to say that there are not some conflicts. There are some religious views that do not accept certainly evolution and may not even be open to science at all. But we should not speak with one voice as if this describes all religion. The dichotomous view is also a weak philosophy of science as well as an impoverished understanding of religion. It is, of course, not the case that all religions are antithetical to science. This ad from the Episcopal Ad Project underscores the fact, in addition, that religion primarily is about other things than explaining the natural world. For those of you who are trying to read this in the back, this is from the Episcopal Ad Project in the 70s. He died to take away your sins, not your brains. I think the attitude of the professorate toward religion has been disproportionately influenced by the creationism-evolution controversy. Here, religion indeed is employed to make fact claims about the natural world, which obviously fail, with very negative consequences for public science literacy. My religious friends would also contend that this dichotomous choose one perspective similarly has been negative for the public understanding of religion. So briefly, what is religion? What is science? And how can their relationship be framed so that students do not feel they have to make a false dichotomous choice? I suggest that professors be explicit about the nature of science, its strengths and limitations, and distinguish it from philosophical views that might be informed by science, but which are separable from science because they are philosophical views. Defining religion is notoriously difficult. We had a tough time defining what an evangelical was, much less the whole enterprise. Now, I come to this as an anthropologist, so I take the broadest possible view. I don't mean just Catholicism or Protestantism or even Christianity. I don't mean the Middle Eastern monotheisms or only other world religions. I'm looking for a definition that will suffice for them as well as for tribal religions. And even religions that are no longer believed in today, though perhaps millions of peoples believed in them in the past. So what definition can we apply to all of these manifestations of religion? Here is my effort for what it's worth. Theologians in the audience can smack themselves in the foreheads beginning now. As an anthropologist, I define religion as a set of rules and beliefs that people have about a non-material reality and its inhabitants. Now, by non-material, I mean not of the matter and energy reality, matter and energy universe that we inhabit. These may include gods, ancestors, powerful spirits, and other supernatural forces. Usually, a religion includes ideas about an afterlife, but not always. Religion often, but not always, includes rules about how people should treat one another, what we think about as ethics and morals. In some societies, those kinds of rules are determined by tradition, not by supernatural forces. Come on, you can do this. Hang on. We seem to have lost the, here we go. Religion often, but not always, includes explanations of the natural world. Religious beliefs almost always include a sense of the spiritual, which is a term that's very difficult to define, but includes emotions such as awe, wonder, reverence, and faith. Now, be sure, these feelings can also be invoked outside of religion. I assure you, when I go on NCSE's raft trip down the Colorado River through Grand Canyon, I have spiritual feelings. And yes, that is a commercial. Finally, religion is very much concerned with ideas of purpose and meaning. And I would like to underscore this as perhaps the most important universal characteristic of religion. It is far more central to the enterprise of religion than explaining the natural world. Well, what about science? Here is where explaining the natural world takes front stage. Science is a limited way of knowing. It is limited to trying to explain the natural world, the world of matter and energy, not the world of gods, ancestor spirits, and so on. And it's limited to using natural causes. And there's a good reason for this. In fact, these two characteristics, or limitations as I like to think of them, are related. As is so clearly illustrated on the wonderful University of California Museum of Paleontology Understanding Science website, the heart of science is testing explanations. Now, there are lots of different kinds of research designs, and this is the point, this is the place where the philosophers of science will now smack themselves in the foreheads at the naivete. But remember, my professional life has been simplifying things, so I'm simplifying lots of stuff here. Just hang in there with me, because I think these are useful ideas to have. Yes, there are many, many different kinds of research design, but when you really boil science down to it, when you really boil the idea of testing down to it, it has to do with holding constant certain variables, and then you can see whether your explanation actually works. That's kind of the, seventh grade definition of science, but it's kind of what we all would agree upon is actually what happens, even though it's a complicated process. The necessity of holding variables constant explains why science is stuck with only natural explanations. Natural variables, matter and energy, are the only kind of variables we can hold constant. If there is an omnipotent force in the universe, it is unconstrained. It cannot be held constant, which is why any effort to scientifically test a hypothesis involving God's actions is going to fail as science. This goes for those who try to test scientifically the existence of God, as well as those testing things like the efficacy of prayer. It's not going to work scientifically. The restriction of science to using only natural causes for explanation is called methodological materialism or methodological naturalism. It's a practice that's employed because it gets results, not because scientists are all atheists or because science is anti-religious. Science is no more anti-religious than long division. It's because supernatural forces are unconstrained and cannot be tested. If we ever invent a theometer or have some other way of holding God constant, we may abandon methodological naturalism, but lacking the theometer, we're left to muddle along successfully without it. There is also philosophical materialism, the philosophical view that matter and energy is all there is. There is no supernatural. There are no gods. There are no ancestor spirits. There are no fairies in the garden. There's no teapot floating around around Pluto. The famous paleontologist G.G. Simpson often is quoted by creationists as, and this is an example of philosophical naturalism, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Another classic statement of philosophical naturalism is Richard Dawkins. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, philosophical materialism is an honorable and defendable philosophical position. It's mine, so I hope it is. But the commonality of reference to natural causes does not make methodological and philosophical naturalism the same. They are not the same. One is a method for understanding the natural world, and the other is a philosophy or ideology. It is an ism. Because philosophical materialists view the natural world as all there is, their position is that because science explains the natural world, everything devolves to science. Yet I think this is confusing these two levels of methodological and philosophical materialism. Let me try to explain this with an analogy. Visualize a garden. Now, the flowers are in competition with one another. They're in competition for water, for sunlight, for nutrients, etc. It would be silly to think of the flowers as being in competition with the soil because the soil nurtures all of the flowers, correct? Let's say that this is not a physical botanical garden. Let's say this is an ideological garden. If this is an ideological garden, we can look at the flowers as representing ideologies, religions, philosophies, worldviews. Some of these are theistic, and everybody can think of a number of theistic ideologies, I'm sure. But there are many also non-theistic ideologies. Some of them, like humanism and other secular traditions dealing with ethics and moral and meaning and purpose, are philosophies of life, but there are many other isms that are not philosophies of life. Capitalism, feminism, environmentalism, socialism, there are lots of isms. This is not an anti-ideology statement. Ideologies organize our lives for us. They are extremely important to us, whether they're theological or whether they're theistic or non-theistic, and they overlap. You can be a humanist, feminist, environmentalist. You can be a Muslim libertarian. I mean, these ideologies are not just, you don't have to just pick one. Very few people actually do. Now, the ideologies are in competition with one another, and in competition with theistic ideologies as well. Both theistic religions and non-theistic philosophies claim to be inspired by science, which is, remember, methodologically naturalistic, not philosophically naturalistic. Science per se, in this view, is not a philosophy of life. The philosophies are above the soil, if you will. The theist-atheist ideological competition should be viewed as being between competing worldviews. Properly, science can be viewed to support one or another view, but it cannot be claimed to compel any particular view. A corollary of this is that neither religion nor atheism owns science. But wait, there's more. Just as soil is underlain by bedrock, which nourishes the soil in various ways, so critical thinking underlies science. Critical thinking, this process of collecting information, analyzing it, testing, et cetera, et cetera. But critical thinking also underlies other intellectual pursuits. Science doesn't own critical thinking. Critical thinking is also important in any number of other human intellectual pursuits, such as history or art or literature or theology or politics or any number of other disciplines and scholarly perspectives. The take-home here is that none of the ideologies own science, much less critical thinking. Thus, we should be able to encourage everyone, regardless of ideology, to be a critical thinker and to appreciate science. Now, certainly there can be a vigorous ideological discussion among the flowers in the ideological garden between and among theists and between theists and non-theists. And that is where the argumentation should take place, with science left out of the culture wars. It's perfectly reasonable for ideologies to contend over whose views are supported better by science. But it's an important distinction between claiming that the ideologies are in competition with the soil. Alas, for fact claims deriving from religious sources, like all fact claims, they risk being tested by science. And in the case of geological or biological claims made by creation science, they are proven wrong. When it comes to fact claims, science bats last. So my advice to professors is to leave open the door of science learning for a religious student. Let him or her decide how or whether to accommodate religious beliefs to science. By not reinforcing a false dichotomy of the necessity of choice between science and faith, this outcome is more likely to happen, resulting in greater science literacy, which is something our nation is greatly in need of, and it's much better for the student, who is in that way encouraged to learn more about science and what science, have the same feeling and attitude toward science that we who study science can have. By presenting science as limited to explaining the natural world using natural causes rather than as a philosophy of life, a professor is clarifying what science is really good at. By distinguishing methodological from philosophical naturalism, a professor frees a student to appreciate the value and power of science without being forced to embrace a philosophical position. Many theists and non-theists are eager to present what they consider the strengths of their relative positions, and in a country with a free exercise clause, they are free to do so. Both sides are welcome to contend that science nourishes their flower more than the others, and they may vie to support those contentions. But neither side legitimately can claim that science is theirs alone. This makes the error of confusing methodological with philosophical naturalism. Leaving science to explain the natural world benefits science and does not reflect poorly on religion. Because ultimately, religion, the Christian religion predominant in the United States in particular, is much more concerned with what's it all about than explaining how did we get on land. Thank you very much.
You told me to be quick. She was really quick. Okay, Jeannie, there was a lot of good content in that. Thank you so much. I mean, I hope we can kind of slow down and explore that a little bit during the discussion about, I really appreciate your comments about, especially in the classroom, trying to tease out the, what do you call it, the philosophical versus the methodological. You didn't call it naturalism. Okay, so I think that that's a really a helpful piece of advice that we can move on to. We are now going to enter into our discussion phase of this very important symposium. I'm so pleased with the presentations we've heard. I'd like to start out this phase of the program with our discussant, who will come and offer her reflections on what we've just heard, and then after that I will invite all the panel to come up for conversation with you and to answer some of your questions or entertain some of your thoughts. So Kay Husbands-Feeling is a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Center for Science, Technology, and Public Policy. She specializes in the science of science and innovation policy. In fact, I met her at an interagency committee in Washington, D.C. we were both serving on, which is for studying the science of science policy. So she also specializes in studying the underrepresentation of women and minorities in STEM disciplines and occupations, and international trade policy impacts on industry structure and firm behavior. She's an economist by background. She also has received distinguished teaching awards, and she is a senior program director at the National Academy's Committee on National Statistics. So she comes with this wide and broad collection of experiences and expertise. She's also serving on the advisory committee for this project, for which we're grateful. And she has much experience also both with the scientific community and with religious communities. So she, I believe, is the perfect discussant to help us tie some of this together, or at least offer some thoughts, and then we'll invite the full panel up. So Kay, please welcome to the podium.
So good morning. Happy to be here. We've had a full breakfast, I would say, a full brunch this Sunday morning, and I'm looking forward to tying just a few things together, but I think in the essence of time, I will just make some comments about my observations and then get right to the discussion. But I do want to do my homework, my job here, so I will talk first about Elaine's paper and the data, and then instead of going through each of the other presentations sequentially in the essence of time, I've sort of pulled together some big bullet points that I think capsulize what we've just heard, and then get right to discussion. So in terms of the data, I think one of the main items that I take away from what we heard initially from Dr. Eklund is that we need to know who we are. We need to know who we are as scientists, who we are as evangelicals, who we are as evangelical scientists, and I really appreciate that we have now some actual data from almost 10,000 respondents, if you weren't here initially to hear the presentation. And so this is a rich data set, as well as not just the survey, but also the interviews that were done, which tell us the why, the how, and we had some really important quotes that are good takeaways from that. There are some things that I found a bit surprising, but one thing that I was not surprised about. The thing that I was not surprised by is that evangelical scientists responded similarly to scientists' peers regarding who they would consult with a question about science. And so there's this set within the evangelicals of the evangelical scientists that on this one particular question seem to map very closely to their scientific peers. So I'm going to try to draw that thread throughout as we talk about dialogue and communication, that there's this great bigger conversation that's going on, but there are also some areas where we can establish potential facilitators or leadership where that can actually, that engagement can be promoted. So just one of the not so surprising, but also encouraging results that I saw. Some of the surprises for me in the data, over 50% of the respondents felt, I know God really exists, and I have no doubts about it. Now, that was not just the evangelicals. That was all respondents, more than 50%. It was about 55.5% or so. Actually surprised that that number was so large. I thought it would have been smaller. Another surprise for me was that about a quarter of the respondents held a conflict view of religion and science, and that is, I call the view that religion and science is in conflict, either scientists or evangelicals feeling that way, and that is the part to work on. But it's actually a bit smaller share than I thought I would expect to see. So that was another bit of a surprise. About 50% of the evangelical Protestants say that the relationship between religion and science is one of collaboration. Now that is encouraging. Again, the idea of a dialogue, of collaboration, of finding common ground for continued discussion and action. And I'll talk about action in a few minutes. I found that to be very healthy, a nice, healthy number to look at. Furthermore, about 3/4 of evangelical Protestant scientists, so evangelical scientists, found that there's room for collaboration, and 40% of the scientists, the pure scientists, said so as well. Again, room for dialogue, room for conversation. So those are some of the big takeaways for me from the data, and it's important when the study is finally fully released to dig down and to get a sense of who are we and what do we think, what are our perceptions, and the study goes a very long way to filling in those blanks. I want to talk now about a few takeaways from our other wonderful presenters, and I just, in the essence of time, just want to give a few categories, and then we'll get right down to discussion. Again, perceptions, beliefs, and conduct, and knowing what the numbers are, they do matter. I think it is eye-opening to see where the avenues are for collaboration and dialogue. Dialogue is the second category, I think, that we heard quite a bit about. How do we communicate? What are the areas in which the scientists, evangelicals, and the evangelical scientists can communicate? We heard quite a bit about climate change and areas where that is a positive area for discovery and for communication. We heard also about health and the importance of health on both sides, and that another vineyard, an area where we can collaborate. We also were challenged as scientists, and this is something I say all the time in my classroom. I teach in science policy, so I always have physicists and engineers and material scientists in my class, and I'm teaching them science policy. And oftentimes I'm encouraging them strongly, know what you know and learn how to communicate it effectively. Because what you know can change the world and can change policy, but we will not get anywhere if we can't just dissect and understand what you know and communicate it effectively. And we were encouraged to tell stories. We were encouraged to get that information across as scientists. As you can see, I kind of flip my hat back and forth because I am an evangelical scientist. Also, I would say that we were challenged, and there were some significant challenges that on both sides, for the evangelicals and for the scientists and for the evangelical scientists as well. One area that's really important to me, and this may not have occurred to most folks in the room, but this idea within the Christian community that there's a white church and a black church. Sorry, but I had to go there. That was surprising that the data were broken down that way, because unfortunately, I think that's a very American thing. I grew up in Barbados for a bit of my life. I was an Anglican, so that's not a white church in Barbados, it's black. And I come to the US and then I'm told that it is a white church, and then I go to a full gospel Pentecostal church, and is that a black church? And so the concept of trying to, even within the Christian community, to take down some of these walls is very important, and to understand each other within our own communities. So that may have been really out there, but it did strike me in the data. I think for the scientists, the challenge is to investigate what Christians, what evangelicals know, what we believe, investigate it. Don't just take the nuggets and the sound bites that you see from those who want to get in the media and on TV. Really investigate. Take the scientific knowledge, the scientific method, and really investigate and understand what our beliefs are and such. And so I think that was a challenge as well. And I really appreciated this idea that we just heard about critical thinking and finding common ground in critical thinking in terms of the evangelical scientists and the scientists as well, just to continue using the categorization from Dr. Eklund. Lastly, we have actions. There are things that we can do. And I've said it many times already, but the communication factor is critically important. The idea that we need to be able to find a way to meet as faculty across religions and to have conversation about things where there is common ground, I think that's very important. As a faculty member, I am not hiding that I'm a Christian, but I don't say it openly. I don't tell my students that. Somehow they figure it out. But also, give you an example. The first day of classes this last fall started on Yom Kippur. It didn't make any sense. I did not, and I was teaching at night. So my first reaction is to send a message to the dean to say, is this fair? Is this what we should be doing? Because as a Christian, I also really support and encourage my students in whatever their faith is to stick, to be faithful, if you understand what I mean. So I also feel that I needed to make overtures to my students to make sure that they understood that this was not my doing, and whatever I needed to do as a faculty member to make sure they were caught up, if they needed to go and be with their families, that was an important part. So I think that this idea of understanding how to work in our communities, on campuses, with other faculty, also with our students, is critically important. And that's one of the things that I think it's an action item, it's an area that I like to participate in as well. And it's not just among, in the Christian community for me, it also bridges between other types of religious communities. I think that we have shared moral purpose between what we categorize as scientists and evangelicals, and we need to find those shared moral purposes and work together for those, to accomplish those avenues, or to explore those avenues. And I think lastly, I would point out that another comment that was made that I thought was critically important: don't present religion and science as a false dichotomy. And in some sense, I'm falling into that trap just because of the way the data are laid out, but also not, in terms of our critical thinking, not to always see it as an either or. There's an and there's a lot of that can come from, and effective action that can come from the collaboration and the further dialogue in these areas. So those were my comments. Those were my takeaways from what we just heard from the data as well. And I think it's really a good time to open it up for discussion and for more questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Kay. If I could invite all of our speakers to please come up and have a seat, and we'll have a little conversation together for the next 20 minutes or so. I appreciate everyone's perspective presented this morning, and I think we can talk about both the perceptions that the survey is starting to unveil, if you will, and also the recommendations that we've been hearing for what we can do better to improve national dialogue on these kinds of issues and between these communities in the classroom, in the home, in the religious congregation, and in the scientific community at large. These are all areas where I think there's work that can be done. I'd like to start the Q&A with a question for Dr. Scott here, Jeannie. By the way, we have one mic on the table, which is really kind of crazy, but maybe those of us on this side, maybe I can share this one. Yeah, and then maybe we can do the same for that end of the table with that one. But you mentioned the importance of kind of understanding and separating the philosophical materialism and the methodological materialism. Now, do you believe that most scientists understand that distinction or are even aware if they blend those two things together in the way they talk to students or to the public? And what would be why would a scientist, perhaps one who embraces both philosophical materialism and methodological materialism, why would they want to be careful about separating those? Why would that be a good thing?
Well, I think a lot of scientists don't separate them. I think most scientists don't think very much about philosophy of science. That's kind of not your day job. If you stop and think of it, I think it's a pretty reasonable position to separate the two. Yes, I think many scientists who are non-believers fall into the trap of thinking that because we use natural causes to explain the world so very successfully, I mean, it really does work, testing works, and that their own particular philosophical views are that the natural world is all there is, that there is this tendency to not really think about the effect of. There's a tendency to not think that that position is actually a philosophical one in itself. It is an ideology. There's a number of mostly that would be humanism. We can get into a discussion about whether agnosticism and atheism are actually philosophies, but that's another thing. At any rate, I think there is a tendency for professors who are not believers to kind of fall over into that perspective. But I would like to suggest to them that is offensive to the First Amendment Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause as a biblical literalist professor presenting his views about the special creation in a science class. I mean, the educational system, whether it's K-12 or even at the university level, should not be a place where ideologies are advocated. They should be religiously neutral. And the ideology of humanism or atheism or one of the other non-theistic ideologies are just as much an ideology as are the theistic ones. And I would like to see the educational environment to be religiously neutral, which means kind of, reorienting yourself to recognize that, in fact, my particular belief is an ideology rather than something that just grows out of science. And it's also part of the confusion of thinking that science is a belief system. Science is a way of life rather than a methodology and a body of knowledge. And that's another interesting philosophical discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much. any other observations, maybe from the panel, before I move to questions out from the audience, about climate in the classroom that may be thoughts you may have based on the survey results, the comments that Elaine mentioned, and from her qualitative interviews, or anything else that you might make as recommendations for the classroom climate. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Can you find a mic? Yes, okay. It may be on.
Actually, not that, but just one little
okay.
footnote on what Jeannie was saying. Your most advanced degree and my most advanced degree are not Doctor of Science, right?
Yes.
It's the PhD, the philosophy of science. And yet, very little of any education that one would find in a PhD program in the United States of America would deal with this topic. So I think it's a very interesting question for the education of scientists in the United States. And as we know, in other countries, a doctor, a DSc, a Doctor of Science, is not an uncommon degree. In the United States, we're all supposedly philosophers as well as scientists.
Nobody takes that real seriously.
Okay. How about some questions from you? We'll start in the back. How's the gentleman back there? Yes.
Just a question about sorting out a little bit of some of the data. So ask people questions about whether they see science and religion in conflict or as compatible. The way that they interpret that can make a difference on their answers. So for example, just people take that to be a function of just factual and meaning some conflict. Everyone should say yes, but of course there is conflict. So typically when people answer that, they have in mind sort of some normative notion. Perhaps should it be in conflict if understood properly? Okay, it's the properly notion that I have in mind. So for example, some creationists will say, well, they're not in conflict because if you really understand science properly, it supports Young's or creationist view, and that's what Ham tried to explain the other evening of the debate. Similarly, you get people like Gould who would say, well, no, they're not in conflict. If you understand Doma, you see properly that there's this difference. So each of those would answer that they're not in conflict, but they would really mean quite different things by saying that they're not in conflict. So I'm just wondering if your data tease out those differences there between those different kinds of notions.
Right. So one of the reasons that we started out this project by doing interviews rather than doing a survey first is we wanted to use the interviews as their own form of data, but also to cognitively test some of these potential survey questions. And so our survey on that particular issue is quite complex compared to some other surveys where we allow the respondent, first we prime them by asking them conflict for them, right? So we're asking about how they personally see these issues. And then we also have the ability to look at whether or not they view conflict and then are on the side of religion or conflict and on the side of science. There was also an answer choice about independence. So that would be more the non-overlapping magisterium kind of view. And then there was the collaboration perspective that I talked about. But then keep in mind, too, that I gave you answers to 5 or 6 questions from this survey that has, probably about 100 different questions on it all told. So these are pretty preliminary data, but I do think that this survey has the ability to get at the kinds of nuances that you're talking about. That's a good statement.
Okay, question, gentleman there, yes. Right.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could, so the results of your study of the survey is focused, or at least your presentation focused mostly on the evangelical Christian perceptions of science. I was wondering if you could speak maybe to other religious traditions that you gathered, if you're able to gather the information, Catholicism, non-evangelical Christian, Jewish, Mormon, things of that nature, if you could speak to some of those results.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to talk about that. Repeating the question, sorry. So the gentleman here asked if I could speak to what some other religious groups besides evangelical Protestants think about these issues. So there's the question of the representation in science, and so we have some about the same underrepresentation of mainline Protestants, Catholics, and evangelicals in science. So there's the pure presence in science, which I think is one kind of issue, but you see a pretty big overrepresentation of Jews and of non-Western religious traditions. I hate that for the purpose of this analysis that we're bunching together very distinctive traditions. And so don't think I'm doing that actually as a scholar of religion, but more because they're so demographically small. So for more powerful statistical analysis, you need to do so. In terms of the kind of collaboration and conflict kinds of issues, let me say to Chris, do you have your tables right in front of you? Do you have any of the ones for, yeah? Let him say to you. Yeah. Right, so you have, if you think about mainline Protestants in particular, about 12% of them, so much lower proportion than evangelicals, say that they're in conflict and they consider themselves on the side of religion. Catholics, 12% have that view. Only 1.4% of Jews do. And I know from other research that I've done among the elite academic scientists in the US, scientists who identify as Jewish, even those who identify as religiously Jewish, are massively overrepresented in the scientific community in comparison to their proportion in the general populations. There's a lot of historic reasons for that, but I think that's worth pointing out. And then the collaboration view, which was one we talked a great deal about, you have mainline Protestants at 43% saying that there's a collaboration between science and religion, 40% of Catholics, 30% of Jews, and that non-Western religion group, about 36% of that group. But as we continue to release more of these results, we'll get really deeply into that because, of course, to know what evangelicals think, you need to really meaningfully compare them to other religious groups in America. That's a good question.
Good question, good answer. And just a reminder, this is just the preliminary first results from the survey. We will be, and Dr. Eklund will be analyzing the results and the other demographics with great gusto over the coming months. So, all right. I don't know who raised their hand. Who's most anxious? How about this person? So many hands up. Be patient. If you can ask your questions succinctly, we'll get more of them in. So how's that? Yeah.
One of the quotes that Dr. Eklund displayed I found very disconcerting and sad, and it was an evangelical who said that either the Bible was 100% accurate or it was all wrong. And I wondered if Dr. Carey, you could talk a little bit about how prevalent might that view be. That's a very threatening response because if you feel that your entire worldview is being threatened by having to say that the Bible is, parts of it are story and myth and human response to the social climate of the time, that's a very threatening thing.
Okay, so I need to repeat the question for the purposes of the recording here. So I'll try to repeat it correctly. One of the people that Dr. Eklund interviewed in her qualitative interviews that she quoted said something on the order of that they felt that either that the Bible had to be 100% literally true, or else it was nothing. It was all or nothing, and that if you could somehow show something that would call into question any piece of the literal truth of the Bible, it would basically cast doubt on 100% of it, and it was an all or nothing kind of situation, something of that nature. Okay. Yeah.
Particularly, this person was talking about with respect to the creation story.
Creation,
so I
okay.
think that's the framing of that kind of question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the question for Galen is, how prevalent is that view within even the evangelical community that if you don't take every word of the Bible as literal, that the whole, especially when it comes to issues of creation and so forth, that basically it all falls apart?
Evangelicals take a high view of Scripture, and we have a variety of ways of defining how we think of the Scriptures. I think it's quite common for people to be fully confident in the reliability of the Bible. Where we have to make a distinction is that nobody can be fully confident in their own understanding of what the Scripture is teaching us. Says we recognize that we're fallible and that we don't see everything, we make mistakes. And so my comment to someone such as the student who made that comment is, okay, go back and study the scripture some more, see what is it really saying, and study your science and see how can the two be best harmonized. So that it doesn't mean that you have to abandon your trust in scripture or your confidence in the scientific studies, but recognize that both of them are in some sense preliminary, and that as we continue to get fuller understandings, we'll be able to see how they fit together.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Jim.
Just a quick question. When will some of this data be publicly available? Because a lot of us would like to be able to
Yeah. So,
take on it.
no, that's fine. And I've written here a much larger report, which we're happy to release. So that's beyond just the PowerPoint presentation, which I think that we released to the media as part of the AAAS. But I have a team of about 20 researchers of different stages, undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, working on this. So we're hoping to get it out quickly. These things do take time, of course, so within the next few months or so. Yep, that's right.
Right, okay. Yes.
We've been having a great discussion in parallel on Twitter with folks who aren't here but are quite interested in what's been happening. And the nice thing is their questions are 140 characters.
Okay.
So this one's in from someone on Twitter. Is there room for a theology of science as a way of bridging this gap? And how do we ensure that churches see science as a legitimate vocation?
Okay, so from Twitter, a questioner asks, is there room to, as part of this improving of dialogue and understanding, is there room for something this person called a theology of science, or for improving the way science is discussed in congregational life? Who would like to take that? Galen or
Yes,
Kay,
certainly.
perhaps?
Yes, there's a room for a theology of everything. So there definitely is theology of science, and I know there are a number of them have been written, but the basic idea that we think about any given topic in light of our understanding of God. And yes, I think doing more, and also maybe making what has been already done more accessible to a broader community would be most constructive.
Okay.
Just so long as we don't have science as a theology, which is a different question. Our isms are very important to us, and they shape our lives and give our lives meaning. But science is not a philosophy of life. If you make it a philosophy of life, then you juxtapose it to all the other isms. But empirically, it just isn't. I can tell you what the humanist view of torture is. I'm sure Galen can tell you what the evangelical view of torture is. Can you tell me what the scientific view of torture is? You know, what is the accountant's view of torture? What is the ballet dancer's view of torture? These are occupations, these are not philosophies of life. And I think that we do science a real injustice, those who do this, not you, but I think when you turn science into a religion, you really are misusing it.
I think if I might just add to that also is that there is, I believe, a way that congregations can make themselves more science-friendly. In other words, sometimes science is just ignored. It may not be that there's hostility, but it's just never brought up, so it's sort of seen as irrelevant. And instead, if you bring science topics into the conversation, into Sunday school classes, and not as a point of necessarily controversy, but just embracing science as one of the wonderful gifts we have for studying nature, studying creation, if you will, that can be a terrific way of improving the climate and the way people in religious traditions think about science, that it can be embraced and celebrated within their tradition. And I think religious leaders can play a large role in doing that. I'm aware that there's also a program funded by the Templeton Foundation called Scientists in Congregations, where they're trying to bring scientists who are already members of these religious communities to be more well known within their own religious faith, because they can be good ambassadors and can share within their own congregations what they do as scientists. So, all right, more questions here.
So Mr. Carey talked about mutual respect, but in the science world, we are not telling people in religion how to do religion, and many of us in the science world feel like there's an important component of the evangelical world that is telling us how to teach science in public schools. So I guess my question is, how would you speak to evangelicals about this issue, about how can they be, let's say, respectful of scientists, perhaps by letting scientists do what they do and not trying to tell scientists how to do our job?
Okay, so the question is, how can evangelicals be more respectful of scientists and not trying to impose their view of what scientists should be doing in the classroom and otherwise? Is that a succinct way? Galen?
That's a fair question, and I think one comment I would make is that we may distinguish at some level between science and education, and in the American system we have a decentralized educational model where local communities do have a lot of input into their the education process. Of course, education originally started first in the home and many times in church sponsored schools. So I think it's appropriate for local communities to have input into curriculum, but I certainly would agree that there should be due respect for science and for every discipline, that it could be presented on its own terms without we don't want the science to be wrapped in a religious package in the same way that we don't want religion to be wrapped in a scientific passage.
All right, thank you. We've talked about the climate in the classroom. We've talked about the climate in religious congregations, but I'd like to ask particularly Jim McCarthy and Jeannie Scott if scientists sometimes kind of overreach the way they talk about scientific results in a way that can distance religious people. Let me give you a couple of examples. A lot of times when we talk about results from neuroscience and behavior or even genetics or things, it's discussed in kind of a reductionist way, that we can explain eventually everything about human behavior based on what we learn from neuroscience or from genetic mapping or something, that we're all basically at some level being controlled only by these things. And to a religious person, that sounds very materialistic, in the sense that it means that we're nothing more than that, that scientist is saying that there's no God, that we have no freedom of choice, this kind of thing. Is there a way, when scientists are talking about these kinds of topics, neuroscience, genetics, determinism, these kinds of things, that scientists should be careful about the extent to which the science can discuss who we are as human beings, or do you think that's a problem or an issue, or do you even understand the question? Okay, yes.
What science does is explain things through natural causes. So if you're looking at a human behavior, you're going to try to find a natural cause to explain it. There's nothing wrong with that, and nobody's going to object to that. I think your contention was that if you go beyond that to sort of either leave the impression or make the statement that natural cause is all there is, you are doing a disservice. Again, this is sort of my suggestion of distinguishing between science as methodologically naturalistic. We're stuck with natural causes because they work really well, and that's all we can test, and any sort of philosophical views that might be drawn from that. Many of us in science, whether we are believers or not believers, hold that the power of this process of science is immense, and that not currently being able to, that unexplained is not unexplainable. And that even if something right now is not explained, that in the future we may indeed be able to explain something through natural causes, which perhaps today does not have a natural cause. I think that's a natural thing, and it's not necessarily being philosophically hegemonic, so to speak. But I think it is very useful for us as scientists, whether we are believers or not believers, to sort of stop and think, okay, am I expressing my own personal philosophy at this point, theistic or non-theistic? And am I going beyond what I can say from the science?
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. I was also thinking in terms of personal responsibility, like religious communities take a great deal of emphasis on choices we make and so forth, but if the science is telling us that all of our choices are basically, you can trace back to, chemical processes in our brain or this kind of thing, it's confusing. And so I just wondered if how scientists can better relate to this.
You're an astronomer, I'm a biologist. As a biologist, I'm very used to dealing with the concept of the phenotype. Everything's a phenotype. Behaviors are phenotypes. Phenotype is the result of the interaction of genes, environment, well, it's genes, environment, plus interaction produces a phenotype, whether it's a behavior or whether it's how tall we are or whatever. Properly speaking, there's nothing that's determined. And, but that said, you know, there is a philosophical distinction between assuming that, or believing, it's a belief, it's not an assumption, believing that science can ultimately answer every question with a material cause, and believing that that is not possible. But, you know, so maybe what Galen was talking about is humility would be useful at this point.
I think you're right. Very, very good. Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add on that? Or we need to close up. We're being told we need to cut off very quickly here. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Let me, anybody have one just real quick burning question? Actually, what I think I'm going to do is, anybody on the panel have a burning comment you'd like to make before we have to close up here?
Yeah, I just want to say this was a really amazing discussion, eye-opening. The data say that where we should look for commonality and for further discussion. This, you know, panel was meant to energize communication and collaboration. And each person still probably is pretty entrenched in how they felt when they came in the room, but hopefully it means that we're leaving the room with really some, at least a little bit of common ground for further collaboration and discussion, and to get some challenging policy issues really met. It's a meeting in the minds of how to get certain things solved, things we can agree about. And so there's still some things we can disagree about, clearly, but I'm all in for working forward on some things that we can really find that we have agreement. And that may sound a little Pollyannish, but that is what I see as a real benefit of this discussion, and knowing who we are, knowing what the data are.
All right, any final observations from any panelists, that burning thought you'd like to get on the table here? Seeing none, I also think one of the observations very interesting from all this is very simple. Many people out there don't even know a scientist, and many scientists don't personally know an evangelical, and so this makes it very, you know, just a distancing that doesn't need to be. So if we can kind of bridge some of those relational gaps in our communities, academic and otherwise, I think that would go a long way in starting better understanding. So I want to thank our panelists for such insightful presentations today, and I want to thank all of you for coming and your thoughts and questions. We'll continue this project over the coming year at the AAAS, so feel free to write us at the DoSER program at AAAS. If you have further questions, we have some brochures about our program on the table. And there is a press conference this afternoon regarding this very project, so you may see some more information coming out about the endeavors here. So thank you, panel. Thank you, audience. Thank you for coming today.